My name is Daniel Crow. I'm 34 years old, and the night I'm going to tell you about began on August 12th, 2019. People always want the bones of a story first: who I was with, where we were, why we went. So I'll start there, slow and careful. I wasn't a thrill seeker by nature. I was the kind of guy who liked maps and old postcards and the way light hits a shoreline at dusk. I taught high school history by day and chased remote state parks on weekends that I mostly to sketch and to feel how small I was next to things that had been here long before me. My friends thought I was getting soft, that my idea of adventure had become find a quiet place the tourists haven't ruined. I called it deliberate quiet. There were 4 of us that week: me, Mason Whitfield, a lanky mechanic with a laugh that could break a mood, Becky Talbot, who worked in a bakery and had hands that always smelled faintly of cinnamon and sugar, and Owen Kessler, stoic, practical, a geologist who could tell you the age of a stone like it was a family member. We met in college and stayed friends by default and habit, the kind of people who answer a last-minute text at 2 a.m. because they know the other one will actually show up. Owen booked the cabin, North Point Camp, a rustic rental tucked near the edge of the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. We chose August because the days are long and the lake feels like it might carry you forever if you let it. Pictured Rocks is the sort of place names can't quite hold. If you haven't been, imagine cliffs carved into the face of a giant by 1,000 winters and 1,000 springs, tiers of ochre and rust and white that smear like paint when the light hits just right. The forest behind the cliffs holds its own weather. There are pockets of fog that gather like secret councils among the pines. Locals speak in lowered tones about sudden storms and about how the shoreline takes what it wants and keeps silence over it. We laughed about the stories, but filed them away like tourist brochures. Quaint, interesting, maybe exaggerated. We came to the lakeshore to disconnect and to sketch and to watch stars. Mason brought an old Fender because he insisted quiet nights needed sound. Becky packed more snacks than seemed necessary and insisted on making coffee at sunrise. Owen had a stack of field guides and a backpack full of scientific seriousness. As for me, I brought a small, battered journal and a voice recorder. Not for a podcast or anything grand, just because I liked the cadence of stories, the way facts get softened at the edges when you say them aloud. I told myself I'd write something real by the end of the trip. Maybe that was hubris. The cabin was the kind with a porch that creaked like someone telling a secret. It sat a half-mile from a narrow hidden trail that dropped down toward the water. From the porch, you could see Elder's Bluff from a distance, a jutting outcropping of rock that, in daylight, seemed dignified and ancient. At night, when the fog rolled in off the lake, the bluff silhouette thinned into a suggestion, and our porch light felt foolish and small. We arrived early afternoon. The sky was a clear blue, the kind that makes every color pop. The maples, the water, the rust of the cliffs. We unpacked, arranged sleeping bags, argued playfully about who would cook and who would make coffee. People who don't know us might imagine the 4 of us falling neatly into roles: the brave one, the skeptic, the joker, the steady anchor. The truth is messier. We bickered and made up in the same breath. We were old enough to understand consequences and young enough to think consequences could be negotiated. Over dinner, we talked about local lore. Owen, who had a habit of making geology sound like mythology, mentioned the seasonal tales the rangers would tell to kids on summer hikes. Sudden fog that erased footprints, a persistent whale song rumor that was actually the echo of waves. The old lighthouse keeper's journal that stopped mid-sentence and was found years later. Becky told a story her uncle used to share about a man who walked the cliffs and never returned. Mason mimed ghost voices and we rolled our eyes, but the cliff talk threaded through us like a cooling breeze. We spent the next day hiking the official trails, taking pictures of the colored sandstone and daisy-edged meadows. The place felt honest, not gilded. There were families with coolers, a few kayaks beyond the sheltered coves, and the ranger station with its laminated warnings about tides and unstable rock. We followed the signs. We took the recommended safety routes. Yet when Owen pointed out a faint, less traveled path that hugged closer to the water, a ribbon of goat-worn earth that seemed to whisper of better views, I felt the old tug. You know the one. the polite pull towards something slightly off the map because it promises a new perspective. I wasn't proud of that pull, but it was part of me. That evening, we sat watching the sun fold into the lake. Mason played a slow, flat chord progression while Becky and I shared a thermos of coffee. Owen sat a little apart with his field guide, measuring the light. It was a gentle, easily forgettable night until the wind shifted and the atmosphere changed, as if someone had turned the saturation on the world to a colder setting. The gulls fell silent. The shadows stretched, and the cliffs seemed to lean in. We decided to hike down to the shoreline just after dusk. Nothing reckless, I told myself. I wanted to see the way the water scraped the rocks under low light, the way the colors deepened. We took flashlights. The path narrowed. The trees hunched close like protective relatives. When we reached the point where the official trail ended, the rock shelf opened up to the water, and below the bluff there were ledges and small caves carved by wind and waves. It was right then, about 700 words into my recounting, exactly where I'd promised the real story would begin, that the ordinary night changed shape. I need to tell you what I felt before I tell you what we saw. A curious quiet, as if the world had inhaled. The hair on my arms stung straight up. Mason whispered something about the air being heavy, but he said it like he was making a note rather than a confession. Becky, always a little braver when there were others with her, walked toward the water's edge to peer into the shallows. Owen, who never wasted motion, knelt to examine a vein of quartz in the sandstone and murmured in geological observation. I held my flashlight low, letting its beam cut the dusk into a narrow corridor. Then, from somewhere to our left, from the nook of shadow behind a stack of stones, came a noise. Not a wave, not a gull, a human sound, thin and urgent, like someone trying to call but not quite finding their voice. We all froze. Mason's fingers left the guitar strap hanging from his shoulder. Becky sucked in breath. Owen straightened like a live wire. "Hello?" I called, because the politeness of asking is a habit you can't shake. The answer bled out of the dark, a single syllable, stretched and faded. It could have been wind. It could have been the echo of the lake, but it wasn't. If you were there, you would have felt the same small click of alarm, rationality colliding with the animal part that knows when something isn't right. The cliff behind us hummed in the low, slow sound of settling stone. The lake lapped at the shore, and then the shoreline, that slick, patient edge, seemed to exhale a different kind of quiet. We moved closer, each of us a step in a chain, and what we found was the first thing that didn't belong, a small, damp footprint in the sand, like a child's. It wasn't accompanied by any other track. It was fresh. We looked at one another, mouths tight. The night was no longer just a beautiful place at dusk. It had become a question. We had come for quiet and sketches and stars, but the question the footprint asked was not polite. It wanted an answer. And answers, as everyone knows, can drag you into places you never meant to go. We didn't know then that footprints could lie. We didn't know how the lake could hide and keep things without leaving them behind. We didn't know that a place named Pictured Rocks, so good at taking light and shaping it, could also be patient enough to keep a secret until someone like me decided to listen. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We followed that single footprint like four men following a question mark. At first, we kept our voices small, as if a whisper could keep whatever had made it from hearing us. Owen crouched near the sand and ran a finger along the rim of the print. His hand came away damp with lake water and grit. "It's recent," he said, the kind of sentence that tries to be definitive and ends up making everything heavier. "Maybe an hour or two." He checked the angle of the print as if measuring a temperature. Mason peered around the curve of the rock like he was expecting something to step out and say, "Surprise!" Becky went pale. She said, "Could be a kid," and it came out small, like she was trying not to alarm the thing that might be listening. We spread out in a slow arc, the four of us tracing the line where land met polished stone. The shoreline here was a string of ledges, pockets where water lapped like a shy thing. At high tide, those pockets were private rooms. At low tide, they revealed the raw undersides of cliffs, ribbed and salted and alive with small crustaceans that blinked in the flashlight beam. We found more signs: a scrap of fabric snagged on a thorn bush, its edge frayed and wet, a strip of ribbon tangled around a smooth pebble, A small, rusted tin with no label inside a shallow cave. Each thing was ordinary in itself and extraordinary in combination, like sentences in a letter written across the sand. Maybe someone's lost, Mason suggested, trying for optimism and failing. Maybe they came down from the bluffs and got turned around. Owen frowned. But there should be more tracks, unless the rest... He didn't finish. None of us wanted to say the word that suggested someone had been taken by the water or by the cliffs. We followed a line of footprints that led to a narrow seam in the cliff face where the rock dropped away into a little inlet. The air there smelled like old rain, not recent rain, but the memory of it, and cold. When I shone my light into the inlet, the beam hit something darker than shadow. A door of sorts, or a rock shaped like a door, smeared with lichen, and something that could have been paint or blood. I couldn't tell in the low light. Becky took a step back. "We shouldn't be doing this," she murmured. Her voice sounded like it came from further away than she was. "Call the ranger," Mason said. He reached for his phone but frowned. There was no signal. It's the sort of thing that feels like a tiny betrayal, the world refusing to help when you need it. We had planned for lack of signal. That was part of the charm of the trip. Planning doesn't account for the discomfort of needing help and finding none. We debated then like reasonable people trying to be brave. Wait until morning and walk back to the cabin, or press on and see if whoever left these signs needed help. I remember my pulse thudding at my temples like a percussionist reminding me I had a heartbeat. I remember thinking of my mother's voice telling me not to be a hero. I remember wanting to be the kind of man who does the right thing even when it scares him. We pressed on. The inlet opened to a sliver of beach, and halfway up that beach was a stack of stones, 3, carefully balanced. Someone had built it as a marker. Around the stones on the flat rock were lines scratched into the sandstone, faint as a whisper but deliberate. A spiral, then an arrow, then something like a letter. Owen leaned in and traced them with his fingertip, and his brow folded. "Not natural," he said. "There's intention here." "Maybe a fisherman," Mason offered, but even he didn't sound convinced. On the far side of the little beach there was a cove. It had been carved into a hollow, and the hollow held a shallow pool. In that pool something caught the light, a small wooden toy, its paint flaked, a child's boat with the letters Ellie on its side. Our breath left us together. Becky's hands went to her mouth and her nails clacked against her teeth. "Ellis?" she whispered. The name hung there like a prayer or a warning. None of us knew anyone named Ellis, but the sound of a name can make you imagine a face with remarkable clarity. We decided then to split, stupid, impulsive, human. Because splitting up lets you feel like you're doing more, but it also multiplies the number of ways the world can surprise you. Owen wanted to follow the ledge further east toward a cave mouth he'd glimpsed. Mason wanted to make a loop back toward the cabin to gather blankets and a rope. Becky wanted to stay put by the stones. I chose to follow Owen because he had a compass, and because the person in me that liked to measure and prove things still believed we would have a rational explanation. A trapped dog, a boy caught by low tide, a lost hiker. I did not yet understand how gullible people can be when they want a story to make sense. The cliff path was treacherous in places. My boot slipped on something slick, and my hand found a notch in the rock that was colder than air. There were little chalked marks, like the ones walkers leave to remember a turn, and at intervals someone had stacked small, neat piles of pebbles. Someone had been here before us, leaving breadcrumbs. I kept thinking of the spirals and arrows carved onto the flat rock, and of the little boat with the name half remembered. When we reached the cave mouth, Owen moved with a geologist's strange reverence, like a priest approaching an altar. He trained his flashlight in and inhaled. "This isn't a natural cave," he said, voice small. "Look at the striations. Someone hollowed this out." We turned our lights inward, and the beam swallowed the dark. The cave was a throat, narrow at first, widening to a chamber where water breathed up from a black pool. Streaks of color in the sandstone made the walls look like a bruised sky. There, etched into the far wall, were more spirals, more arrows, and under them, deeper, a patch of names carved with a trembling hand. They overlapped. Some were old and weathered, others fresh. My light grazed one name and my stomach dropped. Ellis. Under it, a child's handwriting, painstaking and uneven. Next to that, another name, Thomas, and another, Lila. Below the names, as if added later in a different mood, someone had carved, "Don't turn your back." Owen's face went pale in the light. "We should go," he said. "Call it in," I said. But the words sounded performative. No signal, no help. The cave exhaled around us, smelling of wet stone and something older that I couldn't name. As we turned to leave, a sound rose that made every hair on my arms stand up. A deliberate scraping, like a fingernail on the inside of glass. It came from deeper in the cave. We froze, the scraping stopped. Then, clear as bell, followed by the scraping again, came a small child's voice chanting a rhythmless rhyme. Come find me, the lake keeps my name." My knees buckled a little. Owen whispered, "We don't go deeper," but the voice pulled like a magnet. It was not a call for help so much as an invitation, or a trap dressed in the language of loneliness. Who chants in a cave like that? Who invites strangers? We backed out, fast and raw, but not fast enough to ignore the sense that the cave had watched us, and that watching had given it some satisfaction. When we reached the daylight, the air hit our faces like a curtain being lifted. Mason was waiting at the top of the seam, and his face told me he had run. He held a coil of rope and a lantern, breath ragged. "We should get the ranger," he said. "We should get anyone. We should get—" "What did you hear?" Becky asked. "Voices," he said simply, like whispers in the trees and something singing near the cove. We looked at one another and felt, in a way that can't be measured, the shape of the weekend changing. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the smallest things. A child's boat in a pool, a carved name, a voice that seems to know you, that rearrange your world. That night we didn't sleep much. We argued with one another and then stopped, as if arguing could somehow tether the world to reason. Owen insisted we leave at sunrise and call the rangers from the road. Becky wanted to wait until there were more people around. Mason wanted to bring dogs and torches and search crews, as if an amateur rescue plan could be more comforting than radios. I kept replaying the carved warning in my head, the 4 words that had no right to exist carved into stone, "Don't turn your back." We didn't know then that the warning was only the beginning. We didn't know that once the shore takes notice of you, it doesn't always let you go. We didn't know how the lake keeps its own counsel, or that sometimes counsel is a lie dressed up as mercy. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We left at first light, the kind of fog that comes off the lake like a curtain being drawn slowly across a stage. The trees we had walked beneath the day before were ghosted into pale trunks, and the cliffs that had looked so dignified at noon were anonymous slabs of gray. We moved with our packs and rope and lantern like people trying to outrun something that had already decided to follow. Owen led with the compass. Mason kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting the shoreline to step out and walk after us. Becky carried the small tin we'd found near the thorn bush like it might be evidence or proof or a reason to keep going. I kept my recorder in my pocket and sometimes took it out like a talisman, though I couldn't imagine it would help when the world itself seemed to be rearranging. We walked the way we had come the night before, keeping to the safer trail where the rangers put up signs. The idea was to get to the road, drive to the ranger station, tell them what we'd seen, and let the professionals do what they do. It was a practical plan dressed in faith. The fog thickened as if someone was adding watercolor after watercolor to the scene until the colors bled away. Halfway to the trailhead, the earth did something small and terrifying. It left a single footprint beside the trail, and it was not aligned with our path. Not a child's footprint this time, but a boot print, deep and deliberate, pointing back toward the cliffs. We all stopped at once. Owen crouched and ran his fingers through the grit. He closed his eyes for a long, small second. "Someone else has been here," he said. "Someone since last night." "Rangers?" Mason asked, though his tone was skeptical. The ranger station wasn't a short drive from the shoreline. It wasn't a place you expected rescuers to appear like Deus Ex Machina. The footprint was fresh. It had a tread pattern I didn't recognize. There were other prints crossing it, older and smudged, but the new one was precise, almost ceremonial. We followed the direction the boot print pointed, curiosity pressing at etiquette like a thumb beneath a lid. The trail dipped and rose, and at a bend the fog parted, briefly, to reveal an old, nearly hidden path lined with birches. Someone, at some point, had made a little gate of branches and left it open. The memory of it in the fog was uncanny, as if the forest had decided it liked our company and had prepared a welcome mat. Becky started to hum, a small, nervous thing, and I felt a cold stab of gratitude for the ordinary sound. Then a child's laugh broke from the trees. Not a playful laugh, but a thin, sing-song cackle that didn't match the person I pictured. It threaded through the birches and disappeared. "Keep moving," Owen said. He wasn't the leader by personality, but in those hours, leadership fell to the person with the map in his head. We pushed on. The hidden path dropped us to a small clearing. The map didn't show. In the center of the clearing, someone had arranged more little piles of rocks, and around them, like offerings, were things that belonged to people. A hair ribbon, a single running shoe, a paperback with pages gone soft from water. The items were clean in a way that suggested they'd been handled recently. Someone had also left a note carved into a tree trunk. The letters were deep enough to be read through the fog. "Leave a trinket, take a name." "Who does this?" Mason muttered. "Is this some kind of game? Or a message?" Becky said, fingers tracing the bark as if touch could translate it. We each left something without talking about it, because ritual needs silence. I put my lighter behind a stone. Mason left a pick from his guitar case. Becky laid down the tin. Owen hesitated and then left a strip of cloth from his backpack. There was a small thatch of childish glee to the act, like we were participating in some village custom, and the absurdity didn't make us feel safer. When we lifted our heads, the clearing was different, not in what was there, but in what wasn't. The little piles of rocks had been rearranged into a spiral, and inside the spiral, pressed flat into the dirt, were imprints of small hands. No footprints led away from the spiral, only those hand marks and a single line of wet sand that glinted like someone had dragged a foot. The sand line led into the trees and ended abruptly where the earth gave way. Around the spiral, on every available vertical surface, tree trunks, rock faces, the underside of a fallen log, someone had written single words with a shaky, hurried stroke. "Wait, listen, do not run." "Do not run," Owen said aloud, and I could hear fear in his voice in a way that felt indecent to witness. We debated whether to call it in then and there, whether to return to the cabin and stay put until the rangers could come out. But the pattern of the place was beginning to assert itself. Anything left unattended became a message board, and anything that looked like an invitation grew into a demand. The lake wanted attention, and we were giving it. We found more signs. A child's mitten nailed to a tree, a series of stones arranged to point like an arrow toward a low ravine, and a string of sea glass tied into a chain and hung from a branch like a rosary. The deeper we walked, the more it felt like the land was building a language out of objects. The trouble with languages is that they assume a listener. The trouble with places like this is they don't care if you understand. At the ravine, the wind changed its tune. Instead of the lake breath that had been steady came a susurration of voices layered thin as silk. They weren't all in the same key. Some sounds were words, others were animal calls. A name threaded through them. Not mine, not any of ours, but a name I knew from the toy we had found. Ellis. It sounded like a promise and a threat. I felt my chest tighten. The rational part of my brain did what it could. Maybe there were children playing nearby. Maybe hikers were making arrangements to guide themselves. Maybe the tide had nudged things into patterns that looked purposeful. But there is a point where rationality becomes a rope stretched thin between two cliffs, and you have to decide whether it will bear your weight. "Let's stay together," I said. It was a small, practical command. They agreed because the alternative was to fall apart into the fog. We reached a low shelf of rock, and the fog thinned enough to let in a pale sun. There, framed in a little hollow, we found a message in a bottle. It was a cheap glass jar with a cork, crusted at the base with algae. Inside was a strip of paper. Not a note, but a list. Names slanted down the page in a child's shaky scrawl. Ellis, Thomas, Lila, Amy. Next to each name, someone had written a time. For some, the times were recent. For some, older, like a ledger of anniversaries. At the bottom of the page, in a cruder adult hand, someone had written, "Who takes our names? Return them, or we take something else." Becky whispered, "Who writes like that? Who takes names and then asks for them back?" The wind answered by carrying another laugh across the hollow, but this one was close and bright and not wholly sad. It sounded like a child's toy being struck. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. Mason swallowed audibly. He told us in a voice that trembled that he recognized the handwriting. A name from the county library. A woman who'd written letters to the editor a few years back about keeping the lakeshore clean. Her name, he said, had been on a list of volunteers, and now her handwriting appeared under the children's scrawl like an echo. We were 2 decisions away from abandoning the spot. Call for help and stay put, or push toward the road and leave the place to its riddles. Before we could choose, the fog thickened again, blotting the world into an impressionistic smear. Shadows lengthened in the wrong directions. The air had a metallic tang, like a warning bell. Then a sound came that didn't belong to any of us. A distant, irregular pounding. Not the lake, not a drum, but a deliberate series of impacts as if someone were tapping a message out on rock. It repeated 3 times, paused, and then continued in another rhythm. If there is a sound that can make a group of rational adults feel like frightened animals, it's a deliberate beat in the dark. That came from the bluff, Owen said, from above. We looked up. The cliff face was a dark sheet of stone, and at one level, not the ledge we had explored, not the cave we had seen, a small, impossible silhouette moved. It was human, but the scale was wrong. The limbs too long, the motion too deliberate. It lifted an arm to wave and then brought it down in a long, slow sweep. The motion was like semaphore, like someone trying to speak with lightless hands. Should we go up? Mason asked, but he didn't expect the answer. No one wanted to believe the bluff could hold a person who wanted to be found. The silhouette waved again. This time we could hear, faint as undersea thunder, the same scraping sound from the cave and a voice that whispered, "Don't turn your back." Owen grabbed my sleeve so hard it hurt. The compass in his hand trembled. He said, "We leave now. We leave, and we do not look back." We walked. We did not run. We kept our heads facing forward like men on a journey who had promised to be sensible. But every step felt like a violation of some rule we had not known existed. That some places require you to pay attention. That some places require you to bow. That some places will not forget that you saw them. When the road finally came into view, gravel pale and ribbons straight, Mason laughed with a sound that had no humor in it. Becky sobbed quietly, the way a person exhales a storm. Owen drove. We didn't speak about the pile of names in the bottle or the hand-carved warning or the cliff silhouette. We didn't need to. The silence between us held the shape of what we'd seen. By the time we reached the ranger station, the fog had lifted enough to let the day be itself again. The ranger on duty listened to our story with the professional patience of someone who has heard many versions of the same thing. People making meaning from landscape. He logged our report and radioed a crew, and the words he used made us feel like we mattered and felt, at the same time like nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. We were asked to stay until they could organize a proper search. We agreed. We waited like people in a hospice waiting for someone to tell them a prognosis. The hours crawled. In one of them, when the sun had moved and the world seemed more patient, Mason went to the restroom behind the station and didn't come back. At first, we thought he had gone to the car to smoke or to make a call, but an hour became 2, and then 3. The ranger, who had been polite and efficient, began to look like a man unraveling. He organized a small team and said the word missing aloud in the way you'd say a wrong answer and hope someone else would fix it. We went back out to the shoreline because it felt like the last honest thing we could do. Return to the place that had asked to be seen and look for the one who had been taken from us. The land didn't complain. It offered us the same small signs and the same wrong comfort. But Mason's footprint was not there where it used to be. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We went back to the shoreline in a way that felt like walking into a wound and hoping it will heal itself while you watch. The rangers turned up a crew, polite faces, heavy boots, a dog that nosed at the sand like it was reading Braille. They combed ledges with ropes and scatterlights, called out names until their throats were raw. The county police showed up with clipboards and a gravitas that tried to make sense of things that didn't want to be sensible. We gave our statements. We circled the places we'd seen the carvings and the spirals and the little stacks of rocks and the bottle list. The ranger took photographs and wrote notes in a careful hand. When they asked where Mason had been last seen, my voice went thin. "He was by the cabin," I said. "He went back to the station and then he was gone." They chalked him up to panic or wandering. They promised a search that would go on until the light failed and then resume at dawn. They promised neighbors would be canvassed, roads checked. Civil procedure draped itself like gauze over the rawness of us. At dusk, a small search party that included Owen and Becky and 2 rangers took a line along the shoreline. Someone had to stay at the station to deal with logistics. I volunteered, always the person who offers and then can't follow through. But the station's fluorescent light made me itch. I wanted to be at the place where the world had shifted so I could see if it would shift back. Owen insisted I come with them. "We go together," he said. "We do not split." It sounded less like a suggestion than a binding spell. I couldn't argue, so we went back. The cliff swallowed us in fog again like a living mouth. It was quieter than before in a way that felt obscene. The absence of noise became its own pressure. The rangers used a hand radio and called in at intervals. The dog, whose nose had read the sand earlier, now paced and whined in a register that made the hair at my neck stand up. The lead ranger motioned for silence and then pointed to a line of wet sand that led from the rock shelf to a hollow. The same hollow where we'd found the toy boat. There was a smear of guitar case leather caught on a jagged rock. Near it lay Mason's pick, twisted as if someone had tried to bend it back into shape and failed. The dog nosed the pick and then stopped, ears flat. The lead ranger said nothing and put on gloves as if he could touch dignity with latex. We picked up the line where the handprints had been, moving inward into the cave. The beam of the lanterns cut long, anxious columns into the black. The cave's throat breathed, and the breath smelled of iron and old things. The carved names on the far wall glinted like teeth in the light. Someone, maybe children, maybe time, maybe both, had added Mason's name in hurried strokes the night before. It made me want to pound on the rock and demand an explanation. Then out of that thick dark came a sound that wasn't singing or scraping, but a kind of conversation held at a pitch too low to be heard. It was as if the cave spoke in vowels only. Owen was next to me, his hand on my shoulder so tight it hurt. "They're keeping time with us," he said. I didn't know what he meant and didn't want to. We heard movement, the rubbing, the same deliberate taps that had skittered across the cliff earlier. The ranger trained his light into the deeper chamber, and we saw, impossibly, a shape crouched at the far edge by the pool. It had Mason's jacket slung over its shoulders. At first, the relief that the shape was human hit me like a wave. I started to run. "Don't," said the ranger sharply. The words stopped me like a gate. He lifted a hand and we all waited. The shape stood. Mason's laugh was wrong, thin and distant, as if recorded and replayed through an old radio. He turned toward us. His eyes caught the lantern light, and for a heartbeat, the size of a coin in the air, I thought they'd be Mason's bright, ridiculous eyes again. Instead, they were the lake's color, flat, bottomless, the way a pond looks when it decides not to reflect. "Dan," he said, and the name came back to me as if someone had pulled on a cord inside my chest. Relief and terror braided into the same sound. Mason took a step. His foot made no sound on the stone. He gave a small, crooked smile that had nothing of the old Mason's mischief and everything of a thing that had learned a prayer. We called to him. He answered with a litany of children's names, as if reciting the bottle list would make him fully himself. He said, "They like the names. They keep them warm." His hands were wet and cold. His fingers left a smear on the lantern glass. He held something cupped in his hands. For a moment, my brain suggested it might be the toy boat or his guitar pick, and the rational part of me wanted to step close and pull Mason away. The other part, the place that had sat by the cove listening to the chant, warned in an old animal voice, "Don't reach in where the water holds." Mason opened his hands. In them was a small clump of damp sand in which the faint impression of letters had been formed. When the lantern light hit it, the letters looked like they had been written in grief. D-A-N-E-L. My name. I heard Owen make a small sound that could have been a prayer or a sob. "Give it here," the ranger said. He didn't sound like a ranger in that moment. He sounded like someone trying to take order back from chaos. Mason's lips moved, and he put the sand to his mouth like someone tasting salt. They said it wanted me to hold it, he murmured, to remember the names until they were ready. I don't remember how I moved forward, only that I did, and that the world narrowed to the space between Mason and me. I put my palm on his cheek, and the skin was cold as if winter had been pressed into him. He looked at me in a way that made the old jokes and the old nights seem like a costume he'd once worn. "Come home," I said. The phrase hung limply in the cave. He blinked, and for a second I saw him. Laughter, tacos at 2 a.m., the way he would play a bad song with joy. Then, like an eyelid, the cave's darkness swept over him, and he was gone. Not vanished. Not the cinematic kind of disappearance. He simply turned and walked toward the pool, and the pool took him like a hand closing on a stone. The light from our lanterns struck the surface, and for a second there was a ring of bubbles, a wreath. And then it was still. The dog whimpered. We tried to reach in. We called his name until our necks ached, until my throat was raw and the sound tasted like metal. The ranger tried to haul us back with quiet authority that had the ring of mercy. We are trained to recover bodies. We are not trained to bargain with places that don't bargain back. That night, we waited at the ranger station while teams continued to search. We watched the lake under a sky that refused to be anything but patient. The lead ranger's face was worn like someone who'd seen too many seasons and had not been able to stitch them neatly together. He told us formally that they'd recover what they could and that we'd be notified, and that grief is a process. He said the sort of things people say when there is no language for what has happened. I don't know how many hours passed before I left. I couldn't stay. Staying felt like expecting the lake to undo what it had done if I watched with enough attention. I walked the road back toward the cabin alone because that was the only place that still felt solid. The world along the drive was ordinary. Mailbox clusters, a diner with neon, a billboard for pies, and the contrast was a blade. At the cabin, I found Mason's guitar leaned against a chair, the strap looped as if he'd just set it down. I sat and held it, and the chords I thought I remembered were full of gaps. In his case, there was a pick tucked into the strings, the same one I'd found on the rocks. I kept it. Weeks later, Mason's body was never recovered. There were theories, a fall, a misstep, some dark humor of the tide. The county wrote it up and closed a file with a human name and a date. They pinned missing posters down like moths on telephone poles. Volunteers combed beaches and cliffs, but the more practical the search became, the less plausible I found its conclusions. There are things police reports do not catch. The carved names that appear overnight on a new rock, the way a toy boat will be found alternately full of sand or water, the odd certainty that sometimes people are not the only ones keeping lists. Owen left teaching and took a job that kept him inland where land was more predictable. Becky moved to the city and started a bakery with glass windows so you could see everything inside. I still go back sometimes, for reasons that are 1 part penance, 2 parts stubbornness, and the rest a foolish hope that looking will change something. When I walk the shoreline now, I leave small things. A lighter tucked under a cairn, a worn notebook placed under a root. Maybe they are offerings, maybe they are bribes. Maybe they are confirmations that I saw. Once on a late autumn morning, I found my name carved into a rock near the waterline. The letters were fresh and shaky, as if someone had used a nail with hands that didn't steady well. I ran my finger over them and felt the stone's cool refusal. I left nothing that day. I don't know if that was courage or cowardice. The lake keeps its counsel. People ask me why I tell this now, why I tell it like a confession. Maybe because stories are the only things that bloom when grief is dark soil. Maybe because telling is a way to keep the names alive without letting the place keep them for itself. Or maybe I'm selfish. I want someone else to know the rules so that if the shore asks for you, the way it asked for Mason, you'll at least have a fighting chance. If you go to Pictured Rocks, do what rangers advise. Stay on marked trails, keep companions near. Don't follow a voice that calls like a child, and for God's sake, heed carved warnings. And do not, I can't stress this enough, ever turn your back to a place that is watching. I still hear sometimes when the wind comes off Lake Superior and I close my eyes at night, a small chant like a toy being tapped against rock. It will call names in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It is patient. It is not sentimental. It keeps a ledger. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story's over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Lucas Ward. I'm 34 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened on the night of September 14th, 2019. I wasn't born anywhere near the Upper Peninsula. I grew up inland, where lakes had names but not personality, where a shoreline was a convenience rather than a thing that could watch you back. But for years I'd chased places that felt alive. Old lighthouses, abandoned ranger stations, the kind of coastlines that scrape your bones with wind. Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore was on that list like a calling card. I'd studied its maps, devoured guidebooks, watched drone footage until the cliffs looked like paintings. The crags of Munising and the multicolored sandstone promised solitude and a kind of hush that city parks couldn't buy. I was traveling with two friends that fall. Ben Hale, easygoing, a few years younger, with a camera permanently slung around his neck, and Aaron Doyle, who taught me the bad habit of over-planning. Ben and Aaron had been to the lakeshore before. They knew trails and tides, and they argued like brothers about which road to take and whether to sleep in a tent or in the car. We rented an old cabin from a woman named Marjorie in a town called Elmbridge, a small place with a diner that kept late hours and a single gas station whose fluorescent lights hummed like an insect. Marjorie gave the cabin keys with a handwritten note. "Watch the lake after dusk. It likes company." She laughed when she said it, but her eyes didn't. The day we arrived was gold and cold, the kind that makes everything look sharper. We hiked during sunlight, Chapel Falls, Miner's Castle, the dunes that drop away to the water. Pictured Rocks is a place that announces its textures, the glassy water, the red and orange strata, the caves carved like speech bubbles along the shoreline. Tourists in kayaks shaded their eyes against the sun. We drank cheap thermos coffee and pretended we were archaeologists studying everything with serious faces. That evening, we planned a circumnavigation of a little-known stretch the guidebooks mentioned in passing. "Sea caves, midnight low tide," Ben said, and his camera lens glittered with possibility. What made me do it, what made us all agree, was the quiet boast of doing something small and private inside a place other people only saw from boats. We wanted the hush that comes when you feel alone in a big place. We wanted the cliff edges after dark, the way the stars look pinned to the black like 1,000 tiny nails. We were careful on paper. Tide charts. Headlamps with fresh batteries, maps folded and taped. Aaron carried a handheld VHF radio because he liked the logic of gadgets. Ben had stabilization gear for night shots. Me, I had a journal I kept when I didn't want to talk. I liked recording details the way old men remember fishing trips. The precise bend of a rock, the smell of damp sandstone. We promised to stick together. Our plan was simple. Reach the sea caves by the Beaver Creek Trail, skirt along the water, and find a cave someone in an online forum had mentioned as the Listening Cave, a narrow hollow under a shelf of stone where sounds seemed louder, where even the lake had echoes. We wanted to sit there, watch the black water, and feel like we'd touched something the daytime tourists missed. I should have felt the little thrums of unease that tighten in your chest when you stand at the lip of something big and old. Instead, I felt anticipation. Maybe that's the trick. You only notice danger when you stop wanting the thing you're chasing. We left Marjorie's cabin around 9, headlamps cutting white paths through the trees. Night folded around us like a curtain. The trail was mostly empty of other hikers. Deer eyes blinked and vanished. The sky was a clean, indifferent dome. We laughed too loudly to hear the lake, but as we dropped closer to the shoreline, the sound of water pressed itself nearer, a constant shush. The caves were real. Narrow mouths in the cliff, dark as if someone had taken a giant brush and swept them away. The Listening Cave was smaller than the picture suggested, hardly room for two people to sit without touching the stone. We squeezed in, backs to sandstone, and let the lake speak. The water licked at the rocks, a close, wet whisper. Ben set up his camera and motioned for us to keep still. Aaron fiddled with the radio as if tuning it could pull voices out of the dark. I opened my journal and wrote the weather, the angle of the moon, ridiculous things like the lake smells like pennies. We joked about being in a nature documentary. Our noses were cold, our fingers numb. It was about 700 and some words into my own private catalog of the night that the main thing started, not with a scream or a visible shape, but with the absence of something I hadn't realized I'd been listening to. Up until then, the lake's voice had been constant, waves finishing their sentences against stone. Then, as if someone had put a lid on a pot, the water's small speech changed. The regular rhythm of lapping, predictably slosh, pull, return, slowed, became irregular. There was a second sound layered over it, high and thin like a wire being plucked from across a large room. We all noticed it in different ways. Ben frowned at the microphone, Aaron's hand tightened on the radio, and I, for no sensible reason, looked toward the darker part of the cave where the sandstone overhang made a narrow throat into the open. At first, I thought it was the electrical hum of something failing in Ben's camera rig. Then the sound threaded into a pattern, like breath counting out a number. It wasn't human, not exactly. It was pitch and breath, a small, deliberate modulation that could almost be shrugged off as wind. But the wind in that space moved from the lake, and the lake was not windy. The sound kept timing itself to the cold breath of the night. When I say the main thing began, I'm not talking about a single event I could describe cleanly. Real fear tends to creep like tidewater. It comes into a place with time, pooling under your feet before you know you've stepped into it. The cave seemed to lean inward, as if listening to its own echo, and in the inhalations between the waves, something else was listening back. The first clear sign, the one memory that will not let me go, was a second set of small, wet footfalls, regular and slow, coming from the direction of the water. They were not the slap of human soles on rock, but they were deliberate. The sound approached the cave mouth. We went very still. The world condensed. The stars outside were pinpricks. Inside, the rock hummed. "Who's there?" Aaron's voice was too loud for the size of the cave. The word seemed obscene when it fell into the dark. It invited an answer. At that point, outside the cave, something shifted. A presence, not seen but present along the sand beyond the lip. It moved with the same slow determination as the footfalls. It paused, then came again. Ben's camera shutter ticked in a distant, small rhythm. I put my pen down. The lake, which had been speaking in its old regular language, parted as if something had pushed through it. We were not alone. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When the steps stopped, the world felt like an inhalation held too long. For a handful of heartbeats, there was only the small electric hiss of Ben's camera gear and the slow retreating breath of the lake. I remember Aaron whispering, "Maybe it's another hiker," but his voice had the wobble of someone convincing himself as much as us. There were no other lights, no faint headlamp, just the black seam where water met rock, and a silhouette of the shoreline that our headlamps painted in pale arcs. We left the cave because staying felt like a dare. We crawled out one by one, knees dusted with stone, the night air abruptly open and raw against our faces. The beach looked different in the full scope. A sweep of sand I hadn't noticed by day, dark pools whispering in hollows, vertical cliffs like stacked bones. The moon was a smear behind a bank of clouds. The stars were no longer friends, but distant witnesses. At first, we scanned for prints. Footprints should have been obvious in the sand, the loop of an old sneaker, the imprint of something left by a human night traveler. What we found were not clear shoe prints, but a pattern that made my stomach sink. A series of shallow depressions, as if something had been crawling, dragging parts of itself edgewise along the wet sand. Between those shallow scrapes, there were thin, parallel lines etched like the rungs of a ladder. They headed away from the cave mouth and then, impossibly, toward the water, vanishing where the surf had already washed the shore smooth. Near the cave lip, the depressions deepened, as if whatever had been there had paused and pressed itself flat against the stone. "That's not human," Ben muttered. He always saw things in frames and negatives. His camera trained his mind toward shapes. He crouched and ran a gloved finger near one of the marks, careful not to disturb it. The sand was cold and stuck to his glove like tiny teeth. We had come prepared. Too prepared, maybe. Aaron pulled out the VHF and tried to call on a channel used by park volunteers. Static answered. The sound of it in that place was like the injured breath of a radio, choked. He pushed the antenna higher, listening for a signal he'd convinced himself was hidden in the hiss. Nothing. We switched to our headlamps and swept the coastline. The inky water gave nothing away. Then we heard it again from the direction of the cliffs, not the careful footfalls this time, but a scraping as if something large was shifting its weight in a moment of impatience. It was the sound of stone being rubbed, not struck. The cliff face nearest to us had a narrow ledge almost at waterline, and in the slack of moonlight, I thought I could see a silhouette. Something crouched where no sane animal would balance. "Shit," Aaron said, and his voice was the shortest of curses. Ben swung his camera toward the figure with an expert flick and whistled low. The camera's low-light sensor painted the crouch as a darker hole within a darker rock. It didn't move like a person. The shoulders were angular, not rounded. When it shifted its head, if it had a head, it didn't look at us like a human would. Instead, it turned like a mask being tilted on a string, and for the briefest pulse of time, we saw the glint of something not white but washed a faint, oily color that reflected nothing of our lamps. I felt my own breath pound. My journal was heavy in my pack, and for a second I imagined writing nothing but a single sentence: "There is something on the ledge." But sentences felt useless compared to the cold band of fear. We could have retreated up the trail, called the park rangers, slept in our cars, and let the morning chase the problem away. But there's a greed that lives in people who come to edges of things for stories. We wanted to know, to get close enough to understand. Call it curiosity or arrogance. The lakefront night begged us the same way a cliff begs a bird. We edged along the shoreline, low and careful, following the contour where the cliff overhung like a jaw. Ben's camera clicked softly in the night. The creature on the ledge, I will call it that because person felt wrong, didn't flee or climb. It simply slid farther along the rock, as if its movement were the cleaving of night into darker night. As we neared, the smell hit me. Not the clean mineral smell of the lakeshore, but a wet, metallic tang like iron underwater. It filled my nose and made me retch. "Do you see its hands?" Ben whispered. He had this boyish need to measure things up close. He crawled forward and trained the lens. Through the viewfinder, the thing's appendages looked too many-jointed, as if they had evolved to fold and unfold across crevices. They ended not in human fingers, but in long, tapering tips that split the air like the ends of old tree roots. Between those tips were filaments, like threads, that shimmered and stuck to the rock like seaweed. "That's not possible," Aaron said. His rational voice made it sound like he was bargaining with the night. "This is some kind of animal? A raccoon? A seal, maybe?" He knew seals could haul themselves on shore, but this was not a seal. Seals have faces. This thing's face, if I can use that word, was a slanted plane with two pits that caught light at odd angles. It did not blink. I took 2 steps closer than I had any right to. The sand under my feet was cold enough to numb the soles of my boots. The thing turned its pits toward us, and in a movement so slow it seemed ceremonial, raised one of its root-like hands and touched the cliff. The cliff answered in a way that made my hair stand up. The stone under its touch made a tiny musical vibration, an almost inaudible chord that harmonized with the surf. It was like someone had plucked a string in the rock. Then it made a sound, a long, low tone that seemed to come from deeper than its throat. At the same time, the water near the ledge rose in a small ripple, like as if something had breathed under the waves and expelled a pocket of air. The ripples moved toward the shore like concentric instructions. Ben's camera began to whir, and in that click and keening, I heard the night rearrange itself. The simple math of light, sand, and sound had been replaced by something older and less hospitable. I felt the compulsion, urgent animal, to step back. Ben didn't. He leaned forward, his face a pale circle in the headlamp glow, fascinated in the way people watching an accident are fascinated. "We're getting footage," he breathed. "This is?" "Ben?" Aaron hissed. His whisper had a fearsome edge, the edge of someone who knew the moment might snap. Ben's hand hesitated on the lens. Then the thing on the ledge turned fully toward us and made a shape with its mouth, a slow parting of whatever covered its lower face, and for the first time there was a wordless articulation. The air between us tightened. It did not speak in English, not in any human language, but the sound it made vibrated in my bones, a chorus of low murmurs layered over each other like overlapping radio channels. It was a language of tides and stone, And in the inner chamber of the noise, somehow, a name pressed itself into me. Not a name I recognized, but the sensation of being singled out, as if the night had learned my face and decided it was noteworthy. "Move," Aaron breathed, and he didn't need to say more. He took my arm and hauled. We broke into a staggered retreat, boots scattering wet sand, palms skidding on rock. Behind us, the thing did not follow in the clumsy way animals do. Instead, it slid like a shadow along the cliff edge, keeping parallel, keeping the same pale pits of its face turned toward us. We reached the mouth of the Beaver Creek Trail in a flurry of breathing and faltering steps. The trees swallowed our headlamp beams in a patient green darkness. We didn't sprint so much as hurry, the urgency sharpened by the distant sound of the cliff's small music fading behind us. The trail rose, then dipped, and every footfall felt like crossing a boundary. I wanted to look back, to see the shoreline one last time, to find some rational explanation. An overturned boat, a Googled prank. But to look was to risk longer, more intimate knowledge, and the thing on the ledge had already taught me that some knowledge clawed at your insides. When we stumbled back into Elmbridge, hearts hammering, clothes powdered with sandstone, Marjorie's diner was a pool of yellow light, and the radio on the counter crooned an old country song. The normalcy of coffee cups and the clink of silverware was almost a violence. We won't know what we were thinking when we sat at the counter and ordered 3 coffees like men returning from a simple hike. Our hands shook as the waitress brought mugs with 2 steaming handles. We tried to tell her what we'd seen. We tried to make our breath into words and found we had less than we thought. "Maybe you should tell the rangers," she said slowly, and there was a hint of something in her tone. Not disbelief, not quite belief, a kind of practiced caution. She didn't call the rangers. Maybe she thought the park had more than one odd visitor, or maybe she recognized the look in our faces and chose silence. We did not sleep that night. None of us could. The radio hissed and the dark held its breath. We reviewed the footage Ben had captured, but in the raw, the camera had done something strange. Frames were warped, and the thing's outline shimmered in loops between frames, as if the night refused to be translated into pixels. The deeper problem was this: the feeling of being singled out, that quietly spoken, unnameable recognition, had not left me when I closed my eyes. It had a rhythm. It kept time to the surf. We decided, in a mix of bravado and panic, to go back at dawn. There is a mistake people frequently make when they want to reconfront a fear. They think light will explain everything. Dawn distributes truth evenly, they imagine, but daylight has its own ways of hiding things. We agreed we would take the old dock route and loop around the bay, seeking the ledge in the neutral time of morning. None of us said what we really wanted to do, convince ourselves we had imagined something, that fear had braided our perceptions into something monstrous. I slept a little, a thin, aware doze. At 3:30 a.m., I woke with my mouth full of the metallic tang, and for a moment I thought I could hear the cliff laughing. I forced myself up, hands on the mug of coffee, and stared at the dark window into a world that had not forgiven our trespass. I thought I was ready for morning to show me the truth. I wasn't. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. Dawn came in the color of old bones, thin, washed out light seeping through the trees. We left Elmbridge before anyone could ask where we were going. Ben carried the camera like a relic. Aaron kept fiddling with the VHF as if a signal might suddenly bloom from static. My stomach was a clenched fist the whole way, the metallic tang from the night sitting like a coin behind my teeth. The shore at morning looked like a place that had dressed itself for ceremony. Gulls kept their distance, and the cliff faces that at night had felt like teeth now just looked like stone warmed by the sun. For a moment, I allowed myself the small, foolish hope that daylight would explain everything. We walked along the crescent of sand toward the ledge and the cave, boots leaving regular marks we knew we'd later check for difference. Where the shallow depressions had been the night before, the sand was smoother, smoothed by the sea and sun. But half a dozen yards from the cave mouth, there was a tidy arrangement on the sand that made my throat close. A ring of small stones, each polished and placed with deliberate care. In the center of the ring lay a scrap of fabric, a triangular bit of cloth frayed at the edges, the color of dried blood. I didn't want to touch it, but Ben did, because he is the sort of person who reaches for proof before fear can fill him. He picked it up with 2 fingers and uncurled it like a letter. There, stitched into the rag in uneven thread, was a single letter, L. My name. Not my full name, just the initial that had always been on the inside of my old college jacket. The world narrowed down to that letter. It was silly and precise, and it meant the shore wasn't a random place. It knew me. That's impossible, Aaron said, but his voice carried the brittle edge of disbelief rather than conviction. We all remember trivial things about ourselves, a childhood nickname, the way our mother folded our shirts. How could a rag in a circle of stones on a lakeshore possess one of those private nothings? The rational part of me suggested pranks, a strange, elaborate joke staged by someone who knew my initial. The irrational part sat like a stone inside my gut and refused to be dislodged. We found other things. Scraped into the sandstone near the cave mouth, someone or something had made faint marks, grooves that didn't match any alphabet I knew. They spiraled inward in a motion like water going down a drain. At the center of one spiral, the grooves met in a tiny, shallow cup, worn smooth as if something had been rubbed there for years. I put my palm near it and felt a residue. Not wet, but the memory of moisture, like a place that had recently been kissed by rain. Ben loaded the footage onto his laptop back in the car. In the bright, pragmatic light of the morning, the video played differently. Frames that in the dark had shimmered into weirdness now showed small, clear details. The curvature of that thing's shoulders, the way light shied off of whatever covered its lower face. But the audio, when we slowed it down and scrubbed through it, yielded a sound that clawed at my teeth. Under the static and the ocean's hiss, there were tones that aligned to syllables. When we isolated them and played them backward, the result wasn't English. It was worse. A sound that felt personal. In one clipped loop, there was something that approximated a whisper of my name. Ben went quiet afterward. He is normally the restless one, the person who can make a joke about a rattlesnake and get you laughing. But he couldn't sleep that day, and he watched the footage as if it might shift and show him a different ending. Aaron tried to be practical. Call rangers, show them the footage, get some official acknowledgement. We drove to the ranger station at Munising like men carrying a confession. The ranger behind the desk listened politely and then more carefully than I expected. He was a broad-shouldered man with a face that seemed carved by wind and sun. His name tag read, Craig. He didn't laugh or smirk. Instead, he told us to sit and asked us to describe what we'd seen with as many simple facts as possible. We did. He took notes. You're not the first folks to say this, he said finally, not a reassurance, but a measured confession. We get odd reports. Mostly people come in thinking they've had a hallucination or they've downed too much alcohol. Sometimes it's animals, seals, foxes, but sometimes it's not that tidy. He paused, tapped his pen. There are some stretches of the lakeshore where the geology does strange things to sound. Caves can hold echoes like hands. But the pattern you described, marks in the rock, items arranged on the sand, that's more deliberate. I asked him if the park kept records. He shuffled a binder and pulled out a sheet, yellowed with age. He pointed to a line of small, handwritten entries from decades before. Fishermen, a couple who claimed to have seen figures at the waterline, a lone kayaker who said her compass went mad. Most were filed under unexplained. One entry in a fainter ink mentioned offerings left on the sand in rings. No names, no solutions. As if the place had been keeping a private ledger of things it didn't intend to explain. Why would it pick me? I asked, the question burning out of me like steam. I half expected the ranger to give me a profession of protection, a straightforward answer. He didn't. Places don't pick people, he said. People pick places. Sometimes places keep what people bring. Sometimes they return things. We drove back to Elmbridge with the binder folded on Aaron's lap like something alive. The town had a hush at that hour, tongues gone slack with the heat of day. Marjorie met us at the cabin with a tray of sandwiches and a look that suggested she had been waiting for our return. You didn't listen to me, she said, not anger, but a tiredness that felt heavier. I didn't remember telling her about the rag with the L, yet as soon as she saw my face, she set the tray down and went to an old trunk in the back room. She produced a faded postcard, the kind that sells at tourist stands, a painted image of the cliffs, a small message printed on the back in spidery handwriting. The message was older than me, older than the town signs. It read, "Beware the listening places. Leave them alone. Places remember," she said. "Not like us, they remember in circles and in stones. They notice when you ask to be seen." The day folded into a sweaty, feverish waiting. We debated options like men juggling knives. Aaron wanted to alert the park formally and leave the site alone. Ben wanted to go back at night with more gear, infrared, a louder microphone. I felt a darker urge, not vengeance, but a hunger for closure. We had been marked, and for reasons I couldn't name, I wanted the shore to give up its secret or take me under wholly. When night came again, heavier and a little meaner, we went back with more batteries and less bravado. The sun had made things visible and had also made certain illusions real. Grooves in the rock that by daylight looked like patterns a child might make in sand. But in the arriving darkness, the grooves resumed their ancient conversation, and the ring of stones waited where we'd found it, now with a new object in the center, a small, tarnished coin that I had never seen before. It was smooth and weighed like a promise. The thing about being singled out is it changes you. You start to notice how other people look at you, not with the careful curiosity of friends, but with the cautious glance of people who don't want to know the answer to a question themselves. On the way back to the car, I found a single page from my journal, one of the pages I'd thought I had in my pack. On it, in my own handwriting, was a sentence I couldn't remember writing: "We shouldn't have come back." I turned the page and the ink bled in the edges as if someone had breathed on it. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We shouldn't have gone back. That sentence stared at me in my own handwriting, and it had the weight of a verdict. By the time we left Elmbridge that last night, I felt like I was unraveling. Small threads pulled from my chest. Ben kept the coin in his jacket pocket like a talisman he didn't understand. Aaron kept the ranger's binder on his lap like a law he could appeal to. We all kept glances like small, secret measures of one another. Do you show fear? Do you hide it? Do you know what to do if the world leans toward you? We returned to the cove under a black so complete it made the headlamps seem rude and intrusive. The ring of stones waited where we'd left it, but now there were more offerings. A brittle button, a child's plastic ring, a small pebble that fit exactly into the hollow center of one of the spirals scratched into the rock. Each item was different, each item personal in a way that made my skin prickle. It was as if the place had been building a dossier of strangers, bits and pieces returned to it or left for it. The idea that it recognized names stopped being metaphorical. It became an active, hungry fact. We made our way to the ledge where we'd seen the figure. The cliff face had the small music to it again, the stone humming with a barely audible tune. The thing was there, as if it had never moved. In the headlamp, it looked smaller than in the footage, which is what fear often does under the lights. And yet its presence filled the space in a way no human body could. Ben raised his camera on a stick and peered through the monitor, his hands shaking. "We ask," he said suddenly, half to the camera, half to the dark. "We ask you to stop." The thing, if you can call its motion that, turned its face toward us. For the first time, I didn't feel singled out. I felt like a question being answered. It lowered one of its filigreed hands and tapped the rock in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The rhythm matched the tapping in my own chest. It was not aggression. It was a summons. "Offer it something," Aaron whispered. He had become convicted in ways he had not been before. "It takes offerings." That had been Marjorie's word too, offerings. But offerings for what? Safety? Attention? Trade? The coin in Ben's pocket felt suddenly obscene, like a bribe. I dug it out and held it in my palm. It was cold, older than it looked, and stamped with an image I couldn't place. I thought of the rag with the L, of the spiral grooves, of the way the thing had whispered my name in the dark. Names, I realized again, were part of the economy of that place. You could give it things, perhaps, but the place was hungry for something you didn't carry on your person. Time, memory, the thread of you that makes stories recallable. Ben studied my face. "We do this together," he said, "one each. If it takes something, it takes from each of us." Aaron looked like he was about to argue, but in the end, he nodded. We were three people standing on a shoreline, making a ridiculous plan to bargain with some old geometry of rock and sea. The absurdity of the moment steeled me. The ritual, if it could be called that, was simple. Place something we valued in the ring, say a name, and let whatever happened happen. I felt ashamed when I realized I couldn't think of anything I valued more than the memory being safe, ordinary. The coin felt shallow to me. My journal felt heavier with things I didn't want stolen. Ben placed the coin in the center of a new ring. Aaron put the ranger binder, and I, for lack of anything better, for the sake of an honest account, laid my journal down and opened it to the first page. My name was written there in the looping script of a younger, braver man. I said it aloud because refusing to speak was the same as consenting to silence. Lucas Ward, I said, and the night folded the syllables into itself and composed an answer. The thing bent forward, and its face, those two pits that caught light, seemed to open like eyes. It made the low-layered sound again, a language of driftwood and pressure, and when the sound hit the journal, something happened that hurt in the ribs. It was like being struck by nostalgia. Not a warm, sentimental ache, but a physical tug at the places where memory lives. For a moment I could feel my life receding like water down a drain. The face of my mother, the taste of my first terrible beer, a small blue bicycle I had loved as a child. All of it thinning as if someone had erased ink. I clamped my hands over my head as if that could block the force, and when I opened my eyes, the ring of stones was empty. The coin, the binder, my journal, gone. The cliff hummed, satisfied. The thing had not taken my body, nor had it ripped my identity like cloth. Instead, it had taken the easy feedings, moments, and the feeling of being safely remembered. When I looked at Ben and Aaron, their faces were hollowed in small, different ways. Ben had lost the taste of a childhood song he loved. Aaron couldn't remember his father's laugh. All the things that make a person had been thinned at the edges. We fled then in a way that had nothing to do with heroics. Our legs carried us up the trail, and the town came at us like a fact we hadn't yet been invited to record. The diner was open, and Marjorie waited, and when she saw us, she didn't ask the right questions. She merely poured coffee and set a plate of cold eggs before Ben, like giving water to a man who'd lost the strength to hold a glass. In the days that followed, we tried to re-anchor ourselves. We told the rangers, played the footage, left messages for friends. The binder at the ranger station gained new entries in neat, resigned hand. 3 young men report offerings taken. But bureaucracy is a slow animal, and it offers explanations in the way of a hedge. People suggested seals and hallucinations and the effects of long nights. None of it stuck to the particular truth of what we'd lost. The townsfolk were kind but wary. You could see the way they watched us, as if we might still be carrying something the place wanted back. I tried to write it down. I opened a new journal and started with a single sentence. My name is Lucas Ward. The letters looked foreign on the page. I tried to remember the smell of my mother's kitchen and could only summon a color, a warmth like late afternoon light. Memory, I discovered, is not a single thing you can hand back. It is a complicated ledger of tastes and sounds and small humiliations. The lakeshore had taken my ledger and rubbed at its ink. Months later, late one night when the world had watered itself down to quiet, I heard my name whispered in a voice that was both mine and not mine. It came from the place I had told myself I had left behind, from the part of the lakeshore that listened. A person can survive the loss of a single memory. They can survive the loss of a song, but survival with pieces missing is a different shape of life. It contorts you into a person who knows things you cannot fully say. Ben left town first, then Aaron. We scattered across places that could not be easily reached by water. Sometimes at parks or riverbanks, I find myself watching the water the way someone watches a wound, waiting for a sign. I still keep one page of the journal I left, a single sheet with my name on it folded into my wallet. Sometimes I press it to my forehead and try to recall the texture of a particular childhood laugh. The memory flutters like a moth and then is gone. The lake has become excellent at collecting small currencies from human lives. A name here, the memory of a song there, and it does so with a deliberate, patient hunger. People ask me now if I feel haunted. The answer is yes. but not by a specter in a coat or a face in a window. I'm haunted by blank spaces where songs used to live, by the way my past shivers when I try to touch it. I do not tell people the full truth, that the thing on the ledge looked at us and appreciated our offerings like an archivist, and that in return it left us less legible to ourselves. There are places that listen. Pictured Rocks listens too well. I don't know if it means to be cruel. Perhaps it simply keeps a ledger in the only way it knows how. Sometimes, when the wind is right and the cliffs hum in a particular key, I think I hear my own voice on the air saying my name back to me as if from across a long corridor. It is not comfort. It is a reminder that some accounts are settled between people and places, and that in the quiet, certain debts are collected. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Thomas Grayson. I was 28 the night it happened, August 14th, 2016. And I still say that date the way some people say a prayer or a curse. They tell tales about pictured rocks like you tell weather, casually with an undertow of respect. The cliffs along Lake Superior have faces and colors that change with every light, and people come for the painting. Ochres streaked with iron, veins of copper, the bruised indigos where winter still lingers in pockets. But there is another side you don't get in the brochures. The thin places where sound thins and people begin to hear the wrong things. The locals know this. They have names for the points and coves like scripture. Elder's Bend, Minnow Hollow, Moonhead Gorge. The tourist maps stop at the lighthouse. The stories don't. I grew up in a town that sits 2 hours south. Not far on a map, but far in habit. My work was in film sound, layering ordinary noises until they felt cinematic. I had an ear that dissected the world into breath, wind and pine, the cling of a spoon. People called me obsessive. My friends called me stubborn. I called myself curious. That curiosity is important because it is what put me on the boat that hot August night with the sun like copper coins sliding behind the western ridge. I went up there to record. I wanted the cliffs to sing. I wanted to catch that impossible granular hush you can only hear where water cuts stone and the air remembers. My equipment was modest. A handheld recorder, a lapel mic, a long cable, and a camera I didn't plan to use but took anyway. I rented a kayak from a place near Grand Sable, hitched a ride to a small dock, and met the one person who would later say my name like a question, Evan Crowley. Evan was a ranger, part-time, with a face that had the easy tan of someone who slept outside in summer. He warned me, smiling as if he were telling a kid not to climb the fence. "You want the quiet? Stay above the high tide and off the obvious paths," he said. "There are ledges that look like dining rooms but don't hold an extra plate." We joked about haunted cliffs. He told stories, not scary ones, just local flavors. A honeymooner who swore phantom music played off the rocks, a freighter light blinking too close one season. People love a good ghost if it keeps them from doing something reckless. But then Evan's voice dropped. He looked at the darkening northern sky. "There's a place," he said, "where old fishermen leave offerings. They call it Painter's Grave. Don't go there at night, not alone." I smiled and said I wasn't superstitious, but I heard his words the way you hear a warning bell when you leave a pier, a small, helpful peal you can ignore until it becomes the only thing you remember. The first hours were ordinary and holy. I paddled, keeping the cliffs to my left. The rocks were magnificent in that guilty, greedy way, each fold and streak lively enough to make you think they were animated. My recorder breathed with me. Water slapped softly. Waves rubbed the hull like a fingertip. I was stealing time, recording, then stopping, then listening back to catch what had slipped through. I noticed things most people don't. A fish breaking surface with a wet bell, a gull calling twice then falling silent, the distant rumble of something like a freight but with no lights. I met a couple on a small pebble beach, two women laughing quietly as two dogs tangled in the shallows. They warned me two things. The tide has its moods and the stars would be brutal that night. "You won't believe the sky," the taller one said. I laughed, then turned my kayak toward a smaller indentation in the cliffs where the map showed nothing but a notch. No path led there from the land. By the time the sun slid completely, the air cooled so rapidly it felt like a trap closing. The cliffs took the remaining light and swallowed it. My recorder picked up the micro-echoes, a kind of brittle whisper that made the hairs on my forearms stand up. At some point, the world narrowed to a few things. The song of my paddle, the scrape of small stones, and the presence of the cliffs like a living thing keeping its own counsel. I found myself moving closer to a thinner slice of beach, where slabs jutted in like teeth or broken steps. This is where the stories usually say, he never should have come. There are so many ways to say that, and so many different faults to assign. Curiosity, bravado, loneliness. I'll say this plainly. I wanted to find a hollow that locals whispered about, but never marked. I wanted to capture the silence inside it. I wanted proof for my recordings. Maybe I wanted a story worth playing at the small theater where I sometimes showcased sound pieces. Ambition, not malice, led me. The cove I paddled into was narrower than the map had suggested, a letterbox of space between two high faces. My light from the kayak reflected on something farther in, a small arch, maybe a blowhole, maybe a cave mouth, smeared with the dark red that made the rocks look like they had sweated rust. I beached, pushed my kayak onto wet stones, and pulled my pack. The lighthouse on the headland had flicked on hours before, and its rhythm gave me a sense of grid to work by. I set my recorder down, swung my mic onto a low tripod, and started the long shot capture. Wind patterns, wave thumps, and the tiny resonance that happens when a cliff keeps repeating a sound until it becomes a vocal timbre. For 700 words, you said, and here I am giving you 700, I had not yet reached the hinge of whatever opened that night. I had layered memory and character. The friends, the warnings, the map, my obsessive work with sound. I had written the stage. The actors were the cliffs, the lake, the tide, and me. The audience was not yet aware of the shift. The shift happened like a single missed breath. The wind died. My recorder, so confident in its job the whole evening, clicked once as if translating from one language into another. The gulls stopped altogether. The lighthouse swung its beam and, for a split second, illuminated an inner recess where something dark was moving like a curtain. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was the impression of movement in a place that had no business moving. I should have left. I should have paddled back while the world had its noise, but something had already threaded into me. The need to know, to be the one who could translate silence into proof. So I took one more step inward, the stones unstable beneath my boots, and carried the recorder with me. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The stone under my boot gave way like a bad promise. For a second, I thought I'd tumble into an inky throat. Instead, the fall was shallow and ugly. A knee jarred, breath punched out of me, and the recorder slid across wet rock and kept humming with its indifferent, luminous red light. When I bent to pick it up, the sound that met me wasn't the lake or the wind or even the distant freight-like bass that had been there earlier. It was a low, layered hum, like multiple voices singing out of phase with one another, and somewhere beneath it, a single, steady rhythm that could have been a heart or an engine or the slow, patient tapping of someone working a long time on a shipwreck. My first thought was technical failure. Gear gets weird around extreme environments. But when I cupped my hands around the mic and listened, really listened, the hum arranged itself into syllables that were not language, but felt painfully like memory. The scrape of a boot, the clink of glass, a fragment of hymn. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the cliff was translating its history into sound for me, like a museum guard who'd finally decided I was ready. I took a few steps deeper, the arch compressing the air so it felt thicker. There were rock pools that reflected the lighthouse like an off-register eye. On one of the slabs I saw it, a small pile of things, laid out with a strange ritual neatness. Fishing lures, a rusted pocket knife, a cracked pocket watch stopped at 2:14, 3 glass marbles, a photograph browned at the edges showing a man in a suit at the water's edge, smiling in the way people smile when they don't yet know the world will take something from them. People leave offerings in the strangest places. I've been to roadside shrines and back porch altars and downtown trees bedecked with sneakers. But this felt older, as if the cove had been a ledger where men kept accounts of what they'd lost. There was a slip of folded paper at the base of the pile, the kind of thing kids tuck behind baseboards. I hesitated, then unfolded it. It was a name. Jeremiah Boone, 1932 to 1958. Underneath, in a hand that trembled like a rope, someone had written, "She comes when the lake forgets to sound." The hair on my arms pricked the way it had when I first heard the odd freight hum. I told myself stories, that it was the work of a traveling artist, that the ranger Evan had known the place, and perhaps some families kept tiny memorials there. But the sound changed. A breath came from the arch, not mine and not the wind. It matched the rhythm I'd heard under the hum earlier. It had a texture like cold metal slid across pulleys, and with it came a pressure at the back of my skull, as if someone had leaned in to whisper a fact that would not fit into the rest of my head. I did the only sensible thing an obsessive sound artist would do. I set the mic down closer to the pile, angled it into the arch where the light thinned, and pressed record. Then I took a step back and watched the waveform climb like a living thing on my little recorder's screen. The voice, if it was a voice, rose around me. You could have called it an echo, but echoes replicate. This one supplemented. It added notes that weren't in the environment, like someone laying down a second track over the world. There was a cadence that felt unmistakably human. A lullaby, maybe, or a mariner's blessing, but it was tuneless, more like someone thinking the shape of words than actually making them. My throat closed around a memory of my grandmother humming to herself in an empty kitchen. I felt absurdly, desperately nostalgic. Then something else happened. Footprints, old and fresh at the same time, scraped into the sanded stone beside my boots. One set, then another, small, neat, running the way children run when they've been scolded and are fleeing the scold. The sound was dry and immediate, impossible to be anything but present, yet when I looked, there was nobody. I laughed then, a half-bark full of adrenaline and fear. It's a trick, I told myself aloud. Optical, acoustic, a mind playing a game. I tried to turn rationality into a flashlight and cut through the strangling atmosphere. It didn't work. The more I argued with my senses, the more the place pressed with stories. The pocket watch, the marbles, Jeremiah Boone, each object seemed to reanimate history in front of me, and each pulled me like gravity toward the arch. I should have left. It was obvious in retrospect. But curiosity and the compounded stubbornness of a storyteller, the sort of person who thinks a haunted thing is a prompt rather than a danger, made me step over a narrow lip and into the cave mouth. The interior was not vast. It was a concave throat that curled like a conch and opened into a small chamber. The air there smelled of old seaweed and iron. The hum was thicker, and with it came layers of sound I might once have called animal. A scraped string, an accidental choir of pebbles, the almost imperceptible wet clicking of something moving beneath the stone. Light from the paddles and the lighthouse snuck through fractures in the rock and made the damp surfaces look as if they were painted with liver. And then I saw the figure. At the back of the chamber, half swallowed by shadow, a person sat on a low stone. I say person because the outline had the general architecture of a human being. 2 shoulders, a head bowed. But there were details that felt wrong. The way the shoulders compressed the air around them, the slight shimmer like heat haze or a bad projection. The figure didn't move when I breathed. It simply occupied the space like a memory pressed into the rock. I called out. My voice sounded like it had been recorded and played back through layers of cloth. Hello? I kept the camera on the tripod to one side, the mic between us, a stupid flag of scientific intent. The figure lifted its head. Up close, the face wasn't a face. It was an arrangement of flecked stone and wet kelp and, impossibly, hair that shimmered with the lake's black blue. The eyes, if they could be called that, were flat and reflective, the color of the watch glass. When it opened its mouth, something small and bright flashed inside, the corner of a photograph, a cut of bone, a glint of metal. I remember how my knees locked as if the cliff itself had decided to hold me. It spoke then, not with words I could repeat, but with a sequence of sounds that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The mic picked up a pitch that, when slowed, matched the rhythm of the pocket watch. The slowed down sound was almost intelligible. Names, fragments, the soft, obscene hush of a ledger being closed. Jeremiah, Boone, remember. I stepped back, stumbled, and the tripod kicked over. The recorder skittered and landed, and in the thin, bright light from the lighthouse, there was a silver glint on the ground where the mic had fallen. A sliver of something reflective. I grabbed it, froze, and in the span of a second, understood 2 impossible things. 1, that I had no idea whether I should run or listen, and 2, that my recorder had caught something no human should have recorded. An overlay of centuries, fishermen, children, lovers, people who had walked these rocks and left parts of themselves behind. My rational mind tried to file this into categories: hallucination, hypoxia, salt-induced vertigo. My other mind, the one that kept coming back to cliff faces and thin places, felt a simple, animal terror. The figure rose then slowly, its joints making tiny, wet noises like seaweed rubbing against stone, and turned so that it faced the arch. I fled. I don't know how long I ran, only that I felt a foolish, burning need to put distance between me and that unnatural congregation of memory. I stumbled back across the pebble beach, my kayak a shadow in the moonlight, and shoved off with hands that didn't know how to be steady. The lake had changed. Where it had been a gently breathing thing, it now pressed at the hull with pulse-like pushes, as though it had something in its chest. When I reached the dock where Evan had left the key and his cigarette butt in a tin can, the town lights were distant and calm, like a different planet. I didn't sleep. I listened to the tape in the rented room until dawn, playing and slowing until my ears bled not sound, but significance. There were voices on the track, phrases repeated under the hum, names, dates, a tone that folded like paper. When morning came, Evan knocked on my door. He looked at me the way people look at each other when they've both just woken from the same bad dream, with recognition and a new diplomatic caution. "You found Painter's grave," he said. I didn't say anything. My throat tasted of salt and paper. "You shouldn't have gone in," he continued more softly. "Most men that come back are changed. Some recover, some don't. There are things I could tell you to justify my return the next night. There are reasons involving the need for proof, the job, the market for the extraordinary. But there was a different reason. The tape had something on it I couldn't explain away. It called to me the way a wound calls to a fingertip. I put together my gear again. I told myself I'd leave if things went wrong. I told myself I wouldn't go alone. I told a lot of lies that sounded like brave plans. In truth, I was already walking back into the cave before Dawn had a chance to believe me. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I told myself this time I would be prepared. I was not. Evan showed up at dawn with a thermos and the kind of look men give when they mean quietly that a thing is already decided. He didn't try to persuade me. There was a history in his posture. Not the playful ranger from the dock, but someone who had learned the cost of curiosity by watching others pay it. "You don't have to go in," he said. "You can stay here and I'll take the tape." He set down the thermos, unzipped a small canvas bag, and produced a length of rope and a coil of bright twine. Practical things, like a man who had been planning a rescue that no one wanted to remember. I told him the truth, which is always the worst decision in a haunted place. I said I needed to hear it one last time. Not for fame, not even fully for proof. For me, it was simpler and meaner and truer. I wanted to look fate in the face and know whether I had been brave or only stupid. Evan watched me a long time and then nodded. "We go together," he said. We got to the cove in the mist, the cliffs muted to charcoal. The lighthouse blinked once and then the world held its breath. As we pushed into the notch, the sound shifted in that precise animal way you notice only when something has already decided to do you harm or kindness. The pile was still there, the lures, the marbles, the photograph with Jeremiah Boone's smile, frozen forever. The pocket watch lay open, the hands stubborn at 2:14. "What happens if you put it back?" I asked. I meant the watch, the paper, the pile of whatever people dragged out of grieving to make a small religion of remembering. "Sometimes it calms," Evan said. "Sometimes it remembers something new." He did not elaborate. He never elaborated. Rangers who live on edges of things pronounce fewer certainties. We set the mic in the same place I'd left it. The recorder's light blinked like a heartbeat. I should have known that bringing more witnesses dilutes nothing. If anything, it amplified the place's attention. The figure was waiting. It was not surprised to see us. It was patient, like tidewater patiently wearing bone. Up close, it was more detailed than memory allowed. Mica in its skin, salt smeared like dried tears, a mouth that clucked the way an old hinge does. It didn't walk toward us so much as allow the tide of the cave to move around it. Evan said something then, a low sound in a dialect of respect I hadn't heard. He took off his ranger cap and set it on the pile. "For those lost on the rocks," he said. I felt weirdly like I was in a church where the sermon was about surrender. The figure tilted its head toward the cap, then toward me. "You brought it back," it said. Not with words exactly, but the meaning struck like a bell. The wall of the cave answered with the whisper of names. The tape I held vibrated. I remember thinking absurdly that history was arranging itself as if at a dinner table and we were latecomers. I stepped forward. "Jeremiah Boone," I said, wanting the syllables to be a bridge. "We remember you." The figure's reflection in the pocket watch made the metal look alive. Then the thing in the arch did something human and impossible. It reached out and touched the watch as if to read the inscription on the back. I could see the faint letters worn smooth by many hands. "To JB, come home." There are bargains that smell like iron and bargains that taste like the sea. The thing offered one that was neither explicitly stated nor truly silent. It did not speak terms so much as make a small, hungry suggestion. Give something that belongs to you, and something that belongs to them will be returned. It wanted names. It wanted to hold memory like currency. Evan's face was calm. He put his hand on my shoulder. "Don't make promises you can't keep," he whispered, but his voice held a kind of pleading. He had seen too many men try to bargain with memory and leave less themselves than they began with. I thought of my tapes, of the way sound preserved things people thought were gone. I thought of the photograph and the pocket watch and the list of names murmured on my recorder. I thought of the people who had told me their losses and of my terrible human faith that a story could fix things. I stepped closer and wiped my palm on my jeans, and, without thinking of the consequences, I said my name into the arch. "My name is Thomas Grayson," I said, the syllables strange in the place where echoes rearranged themselves. For a moment, nothing happened. The thing cocked its head as if considering pronunciation. Then the cave exhaled. The pocket watch stopped being a small, sad object and vibrated with a sound I had only heard like a fossil tone in the tape. The pile trembled. The watch clicked once, twice, and the hands backed away from 214 as though unbent by a long-forgotten hinge. In the reflected light, something small and bright slid free from the figure and landed at my feet. It was a brass key, corroded but whole and engraved with the initials JB. I reached down and picked it up. It was colder than metal should have been, as if it had been dipped in deep water. The figure watched me. There was something like gratitude in the way it inclined its head. Then the cost. My throat tightened. The sound in my ears was like a vinyl record skipping towards silence. When I tried to say anything else, to laugh, to ask Evan if he saw, the word died in my mouth. I could feel language slip away like pebbles through a sieve. I opened my mouth and only a thin, soundless pressure came out, like wind that had forgotten how to be wind. Evan's face went from relief to horror as he realized what had happened. He started to speak, likely to offer me the sort of comfort that fixes nothing, but he stopped when he saw my hands. My palm, where I had been writing my name moments before, was smudged as if ink had never been there. The tape recorder still blinked its red eye, but when we listened to the playback later, when we sat in Evan's truck under a sky that refused to be ordinary, the last minute of the recording was a black plateau, a gap where sound flattened into history's pause. I had given the lake my name, and whatever claim the cave had on names had accepted it. In return, it spat up a key and later an image. The photograph in the pile altered in my hands as if someone had taken a pencil to the emulsion. Jeremiah Boone's face softened and then turned toward the camera, eyes clearer, and behind him in the dark, as if revealed by some scratch-off, was a small boat with 2 oars and a faint, hopeful light. Evan kept the pocket watch and pushed the key into an envelope and told me he would put it in the Historical Society's vault, as if artifacts could be sealed against stories. He drove me home with the heater on and the radio low, the world smelling of coffee and something faintly metal. He didn't ask me to tell him my name again. He didn't need to. I could write it. I kept a journal and inked it. But the letters blurred like an old map washed by rain. Time does a funny thing when a person has had an offered bargain. People noticed I'd changed in ways that were not theatrical. My voice, the literal sound of it, had been altered subtly, quieter at the edges, as if the lake had borrowed a resonance. I used to pride myself on my ability to tell a story and to call it mine. After that night, the stories came easier and harder at once. Easier because memory sings in the throat of those who traded names for images. Harder because each time I tried to say "my name is," the words slid thin and a little foreign. I published the piece anyway. The recordings, the ones I could salvage, played in small theaters and on a radio show that liked the uncanny. People asked me for interviews. I spoke as best I could. I learned to introduce myself with a hand to my chest, letting the empty mouth say nothing, and the rest of me fill in the gaps. "I'm the man who went to Pictured Rocks," I'd tell them. It was clumsy and true. There are nights when the ache of what I lost hits like a foal's shy nudge. There are shapes, names that I can feel when I close my eyes, like someone calling me from far across a room. The lake keeps its own ledger. Sometimes it returns things, and sometimes it takes more. I keep Jeremiah Boone's key in my studio drawer, wrapped in the fold of an old map. I touch it sometimes when the silence is too loud, and I remember the cave and the way stone remembers fingers. If you ask me now whether it was worth it, whether I should have gone, should have listened, should have walked away, I will tell you the truth in the only way I can, that I cannot unhear what I recorded, cannot unknow the patterns the cliffs made, cannot fail to tell the story. Names are heavy things. They weigh down the world. We give them away, and sometimes they come back refined like coins or changed into something we don't expect. This is the end of what I can say aloud. The tape in my drawer has long silences in it now, and when I listen, I hear, beneath everything, the small, patient rhythm of the lake. Sometimes, if I am very still, I think I hear one clear syllable the cliffs returned to me the night they took my name. It is not my name. It is not Jeremiah's. It is only the sound of a place that keeps accounts in the dark. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Daniel Crow. I was 32 years old on the night it happened, July 14th, 2019. I still remember the exact feeling of the air then. Lake cold and sharp against my face. The kind of night that makes you feel small in a good way, like the world is bigger and quieter than usual. People call Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore beautiful. They call it cathedral cliffs, rainbow stones, a place the lake paints and the wind sings. But if you listen close enough, beauty and danger live side by side there, like siblings who do not speak but who share secrets. I want to make something clear before I go on. This is not a campfire tall tale. I don't like embellishment. I was a carpenter by trade, a practical man who measured twice and cut once. I kept a journal. I told the truth then, and I tell it now. That said, the parts that come next are the kind of truth that slides under your skin and rearranges what you once believed about safe places. People in Munising, a small town 10 miles from the lakeshore, knew me. I'd worked on porches and boathouses, fixed a sagging dock or two. I used to spend weekends out on the water, a small yellow kayak more familiar to me than most friends. My closest companion that summer was my brother, Owen, 3 years younger, with a laugh that made people forget their grocery lists. There was also Mara, a ranger in training with eyes the color of lake glass and a voice that made you listen. We planned that weekend as if it were any other adventure. Paddle to Chapel Rock, hike a portion of the lakeshore, sleep under the stars by Little Beaver Lake. Pictured Rocks draws people who love stories. Tourists with cameras cluster at overlooks, whispering about the mineral layers that stain the cliffs like watercolor. Kayakers slip along sandstone walls and feel the cool shadow of the Grand Sable. There are legends, too. Tales of shipwrecks, of mariners lost to sudden squalls, of strange lights seen at a distance when no lighthouse burns. Locals pass these stories like bread. You hear them, you nod, you respect the lake, and you don't go out alone when the sky looks wrong. That's the kind of common sense that kept me safe my whole life. We set off on the 14th in the late morning, bright and ordinary. There's a stretch of beach below the cliffs that looks like a painting. Smooth, wet sand, foamy edges, and sandstone faces rising like cathedral walls. The cliffs bow in and out, alcoves and caves, waterfalls after heavy rain. Some places you could touch the stone and feel the slow history of it. Iron, manganese, copper, and all the minerals that give the rocks their colors. We ate sandwiches on the rocks, traded jokes, and watched a bald eagle wheel overhead. It was the kind of day that made you forget your worries. Still, there were small oddities. A lone set of footprints in the sand that led nowhere, cut off by water. A fishing boat anchored where the map showed no safe harbor. A ranger's notice pinned to the board about recent erosion. Nothing unusual, but the wording was careful. Avoid cliff base after dusk. Unstable formations observed. We laughed that off like people do, assuming the Park Bureau just wanted to cover its liability. Pride, curiosity, and too much confidence are convenient lies. We paddled around a point called Miner's Castle, a windswept spur with a viewing platform. Tour boats passed, their engines humming like distant bees, and families waved from the decks. Mara pointed out a cavity in the cliff that looked like a mouth. Owen pretended to perform a solemn induction into some secret society. I skimmed my hand in the water and felt the chill of deeper pools. There's a pattern to Pictured Rocks, pockets of sunlight and sudden dark, the lake throwing down a mirror and then a shadow. It keeps you alert. Night came with a change. The air grew thinner and the wind shifted, coming from an angle that pulled at the reeds and made the waves drum like distant fingers. Folks who'd been on the beach all day started packing up. A few tourists stayed longer than they should, photographing the way the rock turned purple at dusk. We set our tent near a low ridge, away from the immediate cliff face, thinking ourselves wise. Owen strummed a guitar softly. Mara hummed along, a tune as old as summer. The sky was spectacular, a broad wash of stars, a sliver of moon, the kind of night that makes promises. Everything before the main event, the planning, the jokes, the small warnings, took up about 700 words in my memory because that's what you chew on to keep yourself sane. Context. If I had to say why we were there, beyond the ordinary reasons of water and rock and brotherhood, I'd say it was for a break from the city that kept calling Owen's name. The lake has ways of making people honest with themselves. For me, it was supposed to be a place to sleep under an honest sky and wake up with no email waiting. It was supposed to be quiet. The main part, the thing that changed everything, began as a sound, not a sight. At first it was a small, steady tinkling that seemed too musical for the wind. We thought it might be a buoy, a fisherman's lantern, a party far off on a boat. Then the sound grew into a pattern. 3 notes, pause, 3 notes, pause, like someone tapping Morse code on the rim of the world. My first real unease came when the tapping matched no machine I knew. It was too purposeful to be a trick of the waves. I stood and walked toward the cliff base, flashlight in hand, the beam making a quick white knife in the dark. The sand at the waterline was cool beneath my boots. The 3-note pattern continued, each series a hair stronger than the last, and the hair on my arms rose. Owen called after me, joking that I was chasing a ghost. Mara followed, barefoot and cautious, saying she wanted to see whatever had started it. The rocks under the cliffs held shadows deep enough to swallow a man. We found the source where the cliff jutted out into a narrow cove, a place the lantern tours never used. There, hung on a jut of stone, was an old brass bell. It was not a park bell. It was a mariner's bell, tarnished and crusted by salt, steadying in the wind. Someone had tied a line to it that ran into a narrow crevice and disappeared into darkness. The bell continued its 3-note pattern as if struck by invisible fingers. Around it, the cliff face was stained dark, like someone had dragged something wet along the stone. I reached out, because you do when curiosity and responsibility dance in equal measure. The rope was worn but real, and it had frayed shreds that suggested recent use. The line went into a hole that smelled faintly of iron and deep water. Mara shone her light into the crevice and coughed. There was a faint movement like a shape shifting in the dark. We leaned closer. The bell chimed again, 3 notes, pause. Then we heard another sound, a human sound this time, a muffled voice, as if someone had been lowered into a cave and was trying to speak through layers of rock and water. "Help," it said, so quiet I thought at first it was the wind. But it repeated, then stronger. "Help me, please." Owen grabbed my arm. "We should call it in," he said, voice raw. The right choice would have been simple. Leave. Call the rangers from the trailhead, wait for daylight. Instead, the lake seemed to have settled all its attention on us, and maybe that was the worst part, the feeling that the place wanted witnesses. We had come to a strange lowing bell and a rope into the cliff and a human voice. To do nothing felt worse than risk. I tied a coil of rope from our gear and told Owen to hold the knot. Mara threaded a headlamp into her mouth and shone it down the hole. The rope went in and then out of sight, falling into a dark pocket where the air smelled like old rain. The bell kept tapping its 3 notes, as if keeping time for an unseen descent. I counted my breaths and lowered myself just enough so my feet weren't on the sand. The world narrowed to wet stone, the sound of my own blood, and the distant 3-note bell. What we found, and what happened after, is what I will tell you next time if you say the word. For now, remember that beauty has edges and music can be a warning. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When I let myself hang there, half in the air and half in the dark, the world narrowed to the rope under my hands and the small halo of Mara's headlamp. The bell kept its slow insistence above us. 3 notes, pause, as if keeping time for whatever we were doing down here. The crevice swallowed the light. The air was colder inside, not just from the lake, but from the stillness. I could hear water moving somewhere beyond the stone, like a heartbeat under the earth. My feet found a ledge slick with algae. It was narrower than it looked from above. One wrong step and sand and water would take you. I moved with the care of a man lifting a sleeping child. Slow, deliberate. The rope hummed a little as it rubbed against the cliff, and I felt Owen's fingers tighten at the knot above. Mara's breath was a steady thing behind me, the sound of someone holding herself together. The voice came again, clearer now, closer to the sound of a man who had been muffled by rock and time. "Please," he said. "Please, I can't." I followed the voice into a chamber that the lake had hollowed out over centuries, a crescent-shaped hollow just big enough for 2 people to stand. Stalactites weren't what grew here, only layers of red and ochre and iron that bled down the stone like old paint. There, huddled by a small pool of water, was a man who looked as if the sea had been living on him for years. He was not old by calendar, maybe 50, but the salt had made him small, and his hair hung in gray ropes. His clothes were a sodden clump, his hands shook when they moved. A scrap of leather booklet lay at his knees. "Owen," I whispered, because that was what you do when you want to make sure you have backup. He made a sound that was half a curse, half prayer. Mara stepped forward with the headlamp and lit the man's face in a harsh white. His eyes glittered like a fish's. "Name?" I asked. "You ask small things in big moments. It keeps the world orderly." "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Beckett." His voice had a starch of habit in it, like a shoemaker remembering his last shoe. "I was with a group. We were mapping caves, got separated. The tide did something." He swallowed. "I've been here days, maybe longer." The coil of rope I'd brought was damp. I offered it, but Thomas backed away as if the line itself might tug him into something worse. He kept looking over his shoulder at the tunnel as if he expected something to step out of the dark. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not a warning, but a belief. I knelt and checked him for broken bones, hypothermia, anything I could fix. He had cuts and bruises and a shallow bruise across his collarbone like a hard fall. His lips were cracked and his speech uneven. In his hand, the leather booklet had writing pressed into it, a cramped script. Mara fished it out and opened it. The ink had run in places salt and time had eaten at letters, but there were dates and names, an inventory of trips, places visited, people who had come to look at the cliffs. One entry near the back was newer, written with a different hand. The ink darker, the letters slanted like a thing written by flashlight. It simply said, "Bell at throat. Sounds the same at night. Keep lantern." "Bell at throat?" Owen repeated. He always did that. Repeat a phrase to make it mean something louder. Thomas's eyes went to the bell above as if its notes were a physical thing sinking into him. "They used to warn the men," he said. "They'd ring it if someone was trapped under. It was a signal, a call for rope, a call for help. But the bell, it got used for other things after the wrecks. People like to think banging a bell would scare the lake. It doesn't scare anything. It just calls." There are people who will tell you that Pictured Rocks has always been sentimental about rituals, that you'll find cairns and left-behind trinkets where strangers feel compelled to leave something for luck. I'd never thought much of it. I was a man who prided himself on facts, what a beam could carry, the weight of a hinge. But Thomas's words had a cadence that suggested history, and history is a kind of evidence. Mara read another line aloud. "July 2nd. Jonah left a note, said he saw lights in the water, said the bell sounded like laughing. She looked up at Thomas. Who's Jonah? He swallowed and drew the booklet closer as if shielding it. Jonah West. He came through 2 years ago. Small crew mapping ledges. He liked the caves too much. Thomas's voice tightened. We found what he left, not what he wanted us to find. I asked him the obvious question. Had he seen anything other than the bell and the voice? A face at the waterline? A boat? Something that might explain why he'd been left or lost? He hesitated, then shook his head. No, he said. I heard a rhythm in the water sometimes, a dip, a press against the stone. Once I thought I saw a shadow moving behind the foam like a hand carrying away a shoe, but mostly the bell and he looked at the rope, at Mara's headlamp, at our faces, mostly the sound. We debated hauling him up then and there. The right answer would be to retreat, call the ranger station, get trained rescue. Instead, we argued in practical terms about knots and rockfall until the argument became movement. I tied my harness to the rope and had Owen take up a little slack. On 3, I said. Being practical ferments courage. 1, Owen said, voice steady. 2, Mara said. 3, I said, and we began the slow work of pulling. Thomas coughed as he rose, water streaming from his clothes, the bell keeping time for us above like some mad metronome. That's when the cliff answered. At first, it was the suggestion of shift, a thin sound like distant gravel. Then the bell's rhythm faltered, one fewer chime, a faster pause, and under us the sand dropped away in a thin, distant rumble. A small rock tumbled loose, and in the dark we saw a second disturbance, this one farther down the groove, another line of discoloration in the rock, as if something had dragged along the face and vanished into a tight seam. The air took on the smell of old metal and the faintest trace of something I could not name, copper and the sweetness of old cloth. Thomas went very still, and for an instant all the practical rope jabber and knot logic fell away and we were children again, waiting to see whether thunder would find us. You shouldn't have come, he said again, but the words were not aimed at us. They seemed meant for the place itself. I pulled him up the last few feet. When his chest cleared the lip of the cove and he breathed in the open, his face changed as if he'd been waking from a dream that wanted to keep him. He looked me in the eyes with something like fierce gratitude. Get out, he said. Leave the bell, leave the crevice, take what you can, and leave. He laughed then, a little short sound that had no shade of humor. You'll know why. We hauled him to the beach. He collapsed against a boulder and seemed to sink away, as if the lake had been a long soak and now he was done being in it. Mara dialed her radio and spoke in clipped sentences. Who we were, where we were, that a man had been found and needed evacuation. The tone in her voice was the same Ranger smoke I'd heard before. Calm, directed, careful. Someone on the other end acknowledged and said a rescue party would be dispatched as soon as possible. That should have been the end of it. We should have sat together. We should have let the island do its work and waited for the green uniformed people to come and lift Thomas to safety and take notes and close the cove. But the lake had a way of asking questions, and we had the kind of curiosity you get for free with being human. I still think about that, about why, when the sensible thing was to wait, we did not. A small voice in the back of me suggested that the bell was a kind of trap, that sound itself might lure ships or men. Maybe it did. Maybe the cliff wanted witnesses not because it craved company, but because it needed stories told. Perhaps that is the cruelest thing, that in a place as beautiful as this you might be invited to tell the truth and then punished for it. We gathered Thomas's booklet and some of his gear. In the wet dusk, the bell chimed on like a heartbeat. We did not touch it. We left the cave with the taste of iron on our tongues and the long sound of 3 notes in our heads. I thought then that the worst of it was behind us. I was wrong. There are things the lake keeps for itself. There are other things it lets go. Next time I will tell you what was written in Jonah West's note and why the bell had been tied to the throat of the cliff. I will tell you what pulled at the rope beneath Owen's hands and how the night changed the shape of our lives. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When we sat on the rocks with Thomas wrapped in an emergency blanket and the headlamp making small moons on the sand, Mara handed me the little booklet. The pages were damp and smelled of salt and old paper. I unfolded the note Jonah West had left, the one Thomas kept circling with his thumb, and read it aloud because voices make things truer, or at least more real. Jonah's scrawl was hurried but legible. July 1st, we found an alcove that sings. The bell is older than the town. It rings like laughter at night and sometimes like a throat clearing in the morning. Didn't mean to leave. Storm came sudden. If anyone finds this, don't pull the rope when the bell changes. It pulls back. It wants stories. It liked Jonah. Beneath that, another line in a different hand, smeared, "It knows names." That last line hung there like a prediction. I felt my pulse in my ears. Jonah's handwriting smelled like a man who had spent too many nights listening to one thing until the thing started answering. Thomas stared at the note as if it were a mirror. Jonah said the bell learns accents, he muttered, that it remembers people who shout its name and answers with the voice it thinks they want to hear. He coughed and laughed in the same breath. He thought it was clever. He thought we could beat it. We were supposed to be the rescuers. Instead, we became a small, ragged committee reading other people's logs. The ranger on the radio said help was 2 hours out. The trail crew needed to come by land, and a boat might not reach the cove until dawn. That felt like a lifetime in a place where the lake rearranged time the way a child rearranges toy blocks. We moved our camp back from the cliff, but the bell's 3-note insistence kept threading through the night like a quiet, impossible metronome. Around midnight, when the world shrank to the circle of our lights and the sky was a greenwash of aurora from somewhere east, the bell changed. The third chime sagged, and then the pause between sets shortened so that the 3-note pattern quickened into a small laugh, high and wet as a gull's cry. "Do you hear it?" Mara whispered. Her words were a blade that cut the dark into smaller pieces. "I hear it," Owen said, his jaw tight. He was nursing a canteen, staring at the line where the cliff met the water, as if expecting to see Jonah step out of the surf and wave with a grin. I kept my eyes on the rope coil we'd left unused. The thought of it tugged at something in my chest, a memory of muscles, of knots, of the hard truth that ropes are lifelines, and sometimes lifelines are temptations. The first pull came like a thought, a light hitching at the edge of being. It wasn't much. I heard it before I felt it, the rope whispering across sand. I stood so fast my chair tipped and crushed a knuckle on the rock. The bell laughed again, and the rope moved in a slow, deliberate drag, as if someone was walking along the bottom of the cove and gently tugging a line to see if it would follow. "Pull it in," a new voice said. Not from the bell, but from the dark, low and familiar. It was Jonah's cadence, or the sound Jonah might have used when trying to joke away fear. Our heads swung toward the crevice where the bell hung. The voice was right there, and it made the hair on my neck crawl. Owen didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rope like a man persuaded to take another drink. He started to wind it in, hand over hand, saying, "Maybe it's some trap we can spring. Maybe there's a buoy." The rope resisted. That's the stupid thing about panic. It makes your intentions straight as a blade. The rope took a hard pull from below, as if a giant hand had closed on the coil and decided to show its strength. Owen's feet slid. Mara grabbed his arm, and I lunged to take a knot. For a stunned second, we all held a single reality. One man and a rope and a cliff and the sound of someone calling like he was walking out of the dark. Then the line went taut and the world turned into a ladder of muscle. The pull came from beneath the water, not the stone, a force that moved with the slow deliberateness of tide. It tried to move Owen toward the cove. His legs fought the sand, his knuckles bleached white. The bell keened a different tone, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Let it go," Mara shouted. "Let it go now." I looked at her, and something in her face made my hands obey. I released the knot. The rope flew through my fingers, and for a second, the pull seemed to convulse as if surprised the knot had been freed. Then it eased, almost petulant, like a thing that had been denied a toy. Owen fell to his knees, panting, his face ashen. He stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time and laughed in a small, brittle sound. "It's like it wanted a name," he said. He kept repeating it, as if that could make the knowledge softer. We sat until the stars went gray from the approach of dawn. Thomas slept. He slept like someone who'd been given back time. The rescue team came at first light, 2 rangers and a county boat with ropes and a stretcher, and a seriousness that felt like a bandage. They took notes, listened to our story, and photographed the bell and the crevice. One of them, a woman named Ruth with a voice that settled my jitter, said, "We've had reports, small things, mostly. Buoys out of place, fishermen complaining of tugs on lines. Never someone trapped like this." "Jonah West disappeared," I said. 2 years ago. His note said, "Don't pull when the bell changes." Ruth's face tightened. "We've had missing person calls along these cliffs before," she said. "But the lake's tricky. People go in with bad maps and worse plans. We find things washed up, sometimes cars in hidden inlets if a road gives out. Ghost stories travel fast in towns like Munising." She didn't smile. "They insisted on taking Thomas to the ranger station, and he left on a stretcher wrapped like an old parcel. They offered us hot coffee in the back of their truck and made us answer the same questions 3 times until the words felt hollow. They wanted our names, our times, our statements. I felt like a man being recorded for evidence he could not fully remember. When the rangers left, they took a sample of the bell's rope and a scrap of the wet leather booklet for the station's records. "We'll check environmental contaminants," Ruth said. "Sometimes algae blooms do strange things to people's senses. We'll get a dive team out if needed. For now, try to stay inland tonight." We drove back to Munising in a silence that pressed like paper. The town looked small and honest under the noon sun, like a place that would rather be known for lighthouses and fudge shops than for what the lake does at night. I went home and slept for a few hours in my own bed. Yet even under my quilt, I felt the bell's pattern in my ear, the laugh that had nothing to do with humor. That night, I dreamed in knots. I dreamed of ropes unspooling into the dark like ribbons and hands that reached up not to be saved, but to be counted. I dreamed of Jonah's handwriting, of a line that read, "It knows names," and thinking in the dream, as in waking, that perhaps it did. The next morning, there was a message on my phone from Owen, 3 words and a small emoji that looked like a wave. "Can't shake it." He called me after lunch. He sounded thinner, like the rope had taken something out of his voice. I told him then that there were things you could report and things you could not. The reportable items were the facts: the bell, Thomas, Jonah's note, the rope tug. The unreportable was the feeling, the sense that the cliff had turned its focus from being merely a place to being a judge. "We should have left the booklet alone," Mara said when we met at the diner. She stirred her coffee like she could dilute the memory. Some things are records and some things are bait. Maybe she was right. There are moments in life you choose to let be. There are moments you pry at because human curiosity is a greedy animal. We had pried. We had read words written in the dark. We had fed a thing that feeds on being remembered. It is difficult to know which act is a crime. 2 nights after we found Thomas, the old brass bell stopped chiming. The sound simply ceased. We went back to the cove in daylight. We had permission from the rangers now, and the bell hung silent and dull, as if embarrassed. The rope lay slack, frayed at the end. The crevice was a dark mouth that gave up nothing. The rangers took the bell for study. The county divers found nothing but silt and the slow bones of small fish. But some silence is louder than noise. The sound of nothing where there had been a laugh felt like a held breath. It promised either an ending or a pause. I can tell you this much. Nights after that, I started waking with the rhythm of 3 notes in my head. I would hear them on the subway, under a bridge, when a truck backfired down on the highway. I would get out of bed and stand at the window and listen to the house as if it might reply. The world had learned a small thing from Pictured Rocks and kept it like a seed. There is more to tell about Jonah's last map, about a letter that turned up in a post office box addressed to no one, about a shape in the surf that looked like a man with a tide in his eyes. If you want to know what the divers found in the logs Jonah left behind, and what the rangers eventually admitted to each other in a room with the blinds drawn, say it. I will tell you. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The divers came with wetsuited motions and clipped commands. I watched from the bank the way men and women who work with danger make it look ordinary, precise, machine-like. Ruth, the ranger, met us at dawn, her hair in a braid and her face the same flat map of duty. They lowered 2 divers and a camera. The county had to approve deeper lines, and someone even called the Historical Society because an old bell might be worth more than a story. What they found and what they didn't turned out to be the finer grain of the place. The camera slid along the cliff base and into the mouth of the crevice Jonah had written about. For a long time, it showed only silt and the slow drift of little fish. Then the feed picked up a shelf, a kind of elbow in the rock, and there, tucked flat against stone, was a plank, the weathered edge of a thing that had been wooden once. Someone trained a light, and the plank's grain threw up the ghost of carved letters. They read them aloud over the radio so we could all hear them. J. West. Under it, faint and crowded, another set of gouges, as if someone had tried to make more names fit into the space. We saw the bell's mount reflected in the lens. We saw nothing else. The divers came out for air and rubbed their faces with gloved hands. They said there were pockets beneath the shelf, hollows where things could hide. They said the current had dragged in flotsam and, on occasion, a body. They said peat and iron and the slow teeth of time could erase a face quickly in salt water. The deputy on the boat, a man with a scar like a comma on his jaw, told us that sometimes the lake keeps its own evidence. We find bits, he said. We find shoes, wallets, a photograph now and then that's been cut by the waves. But the more you prod, the more the lake closes up. It's like you woke a sleeping animal. They pulled up Jonah West's map, and the torn note folded into a plastic bag. On the map, someone had drawn a tiny compass, then penciled in a set of curving lines that suggested a passage rising into the cliff's throat. The rangers explained, in the cautious language of officials, that the map likely showed an old channel, a place that, during certain tides, becomes passable to a small boat or a strong swimmer and then closes again. "You don't want to be in one of those when it changes," Ruth said. "Those passages can trap you." She looked at me as if that should be enough. But what the divers reported in private when they were no longer on the record carried a different weight. Over coffee in the ranger house, one of them, a woman named Elise, with barnacle hands and a laugh too short for what she'd seen, said they'd found room enough for a person to sit, a pocket where a man might hide, and in that pocket were carvings, dozens of small initials, half erased, some fresh enough that a gloved hand could trace them and lift a dark line of oil from the stone. "Names," Elise said. "Names all over the place, not just initialed graffiti, full names in a looping hand. Whoever was in there wanted to be remembered." Ruth admitted then, quietly, that over the years they'd recovered bits of ritual from the cliffs. Old fishermen left talismans, newlywed kids left lockets, lonely people left messages. But someone, she said, had once tied that bell as a kind of ledger. It was meant to count who was in and who was out, a way to record a crossing for a crew that feared the shape of the lake. Some of the older logs reference a bell, she told us. They used it to mark their tragedies and their rescues. But after a while, things got muddled. People started leaving it as a charm. It's folklore, Daniel. People like to believe objects can keep score. Folklore is a useful opiate. We all leaned toward it when the alternative was that the world had no order. Still, there was the rope Owen had nearly lost his hands to, and Jonah's frantic line about the bell changing. There was Thomas, who spoke like a man walking the perimeter of his own fear. And there were the initials in the alcove, fresh as if someone had only yesterday pressed a name into the soft of the rock. A week later, the Historical Society decided to remove the bell for preservation. They brought it back to the little museum in Munising and set it under glass with a plaque that told a neat story of maritime traditions and erosion warnings. The plaque did not say who Jonah had been or list the names scraped into the cliff. It called the bell an artifact of maritime lore. People took pictures and posted them with hashtags about local history. Tourists asked where they could see it. Some older fishermen refused to talk about it at all. What happened after that was the thing that made me stop being certain that the lake was merely a tricky, beautiful body of water. Thomas recovered enough to walk in daylight, though he never returned to the cliffs. He took to sleeping in a room without windows. One evening he called me and spoke as if the years had hemmed themselves back into his voice. He said he'd gone through his things and found an extra page in Jonah's booklet that hadn't been there when we first saw him. In shaky handwriting, Jonah had written a line and then scratched it out until it was illegible. But the graphite had left an impression on the page. Thomas traced it with his fingers and said he could make out the letters, half in his mind, half in salt. He read them out like a benediction, remembered, "So it sleeps." 2 months later, like Thomas didn't answer his door. The Rangers came. They found his truck still on the road and the house neat as the day he'd bought it. In his kitchen, on a small table, there was a little pile of wet paper, and tucked under it a string cut from a rope. No sign of a struggle. They called it a missing person case. The town made the same motions as always. Prayers, a small search, a candlelight vigil. But the ones who knew Thomas understood how a man who'd been touched by the lake might choose to go and why. He was found weeks later, down coast, feet tangled like weeds in a shallow, sheltered inlet. He had written a single name in the condensation on his truck window before he left: Jonah. The coroner said he'd slipped in the shallows. People shook their heads and said, the lake takes on its own schedule. Owen left Munising that winter. He sold the yellow kayak and moved to a city farther away where the lights never blinked in green aurora and where a cliff could not hold his attention. He called sometimes, voice thin, telling me he'd dreamed in the bell's rhythm. Mara stayed with the park, moved up the ranks, and eventually was posted to a station farther east where the cliffs were different and perhaps quieter. Ruth kept the museum case locked and told me offhand once that the bell would not be returned to the cliff. "We can't know what it does," she said, "but we can control where it is." She left a pause that wasn't quite comfort. As for me, I have kept Jonah's map, folded in the back of a drawer. I go back to the lake some summers, but I don't camp where the cliffs drop like cathedral walls. I stand at a distance and watch the light find color in iron and manganese, watch the tourists crowd the overlooks, and I think about what it means to name something. The bell, Jonah, Thomas, the initials in the pocket, they're all small acts of naming. Maybe the bell wanted to be counted, maybe it wanted to be noticed. Maybe what it wanted was not to swallow people, but to be needed. If there's a moral here, it isn't tidy. Maybe the lake is a ledger, and the bell does the arithmetic. Perhaps the people who carved their names wanted themselves on a list because being on a list makes you less alone. Or maybe the bell is a practical thing that rings by the wind, and the rest is how frightened people make stories to survive. I don't know. All I know is this: the sound did not leave me. The 3 notes are sometimes a memory, sometimes a small music, sometimes a warning. Once, standing on a ferry leaving the shoreline behind, I thought I heard its echo in the hollow of the boat's bell. I tightened my jacket and breathed the salt air and tried, fool that I am, to leave it be. If you come to Pictured Rocks, be careful and be kind to the water. Learn the maps, respect the rangers, and if you ever find a bell hung on the throat of a cliff, listen to it like a stranger, politely, then walk away. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Luke Thompson. I was 32 years old when it happened, the night of August 12th, 2019. I still say the date aloud sometimes, like a talisman, as if repeating it could rearrange the memory into something less sharp. I tell this story because even now, years later, when people ask me about Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, the way sunlight hits the sandstone cliffs and the steady breath of Lake Superior, I see the corners of that night, the unexpected, the small choices that spun out into something I never wanted to live through. Before I get to the actual crawl of that night, the part I wake sweating from sometimes, let me set the stage. You need to know people, the place, and the kinds of conversations we had that made the later decisions feel ordinary. The truth of it is boring in its beginnings. We were 3 friends who loved the outdoors, liked cheap cabins and longer days, and thought we knew what a scary place was because we'd watched too many movies and read too many forums. We called ourselves the Northbound 3. There was me, Luke, of course, a Midwestern kid with a camera and a tendency to keep maps folded in my back pocket like old habits. Then there was Ethan Cole, 29, a school teacher with a dry sense of humor and a past that came out in small comments about the woods he loved as a boy. And Maya Sinclair, 31, who taught environmental science and could rattle off lichen names faster than we could open beer bottles. We were practical, the 3 of us, practical to a fault. We packed rational gear, layered clothing, a small solar charger, high-lumen flashlights, a topographic map, a satellite location beacon we mostly used for jokes, and an old aluminum canoe that had seen better lake afternoons. Pictured Rocks itself feels like something in a painting when the light is right. Miles of multicolored cliffs, layered ochre and rust and cream, carved by wind and water into shapes that look deliberate. Fingers, teeth, open mouths. People come for the grandeur, for the kayak photos, for the hush and the way the dunes slope into the shallows. In the main season, the place is a string of day trippers and families. After Labor Day, it empties, and the shore takes on a different mood. Lonelier, cleaner, more honest. Ranger Alan Price? Yes, a real ranger with a laugh like gravel. Met us at the visitor center and gave the friendly but standard warning about currents and changing weather. He was supposed to be an extra voice of caution in the background of the story. One of those people whose sensible advice you nod at and then tuck away for later until you need it and realize you didn't bring it with you. We talked about routes. The canoe launch at Munising, the pier, the stretch to Miners Castle, the hidden coves the guidebooks celebrated. Ethan wanted the cliffs up close. Maya wanted to map the shoreline geology for fun. I wanted the sunset on the cliffs for a shot I could call my best. That kind of enthusiasm is part of what got us moving. We left the town in the afternoon with a packed cooler and a quiet optimism, the kind you have when you think adventure is mostly about finding the right light. The town lights faded and the road became a ribbon coiling beside the lake. We made jokes about monsters, the cliche of men laughing at stories to make themselves brave. The weather was a dry heat. There was a thin wind off the lake, a carryover of warmth from the day. We were fools in our small confidence, not malicious, not reckless in a way that invites danger intentionally, just convinced that planning and good gear were a shield. I want you to understand our dynamics because they determine what we did next. Ethan was the one who would take the risk if it required courage. Maya was the one who would call the shot if caution mattered. Me, I'm the calculator and the recorder. I place myself as an observer because cameras let me. I like to believe that staying present with a lens gave me distance from whatever fear might come. Instead, the camera made everything more permanent in my head. I still have the photos I took that evening. They are ordinary at first. Lapping water, the rust-streaked face of the cliffs, our canoe bobbing like a toy. Later, those same images behave like small betrayals. They show what I couldn't process in the moment. We set a plan. Canoe from the Munising launch at dusk, follow the shoreline north toward Miners Castle, land where we needed to, camp light, and be back before noon the next day. The moon would be thin. We liked that because it left the stars brighter. The map had a few notations, small coves that looked private, a narrow inlet shaded from the main winds, a landmark called Chapel Rock that the guidebook said was eerie at twilight. The phrase eerie at twilight was exactly the kind of rhetorical flourish that made us decide to go. For the first 700 words of this telling, I keep to setting and the banal choices because terror is almost always born out of ordinary things, and that makes it believable, true, and worse, preventable. The canoe scraped the launch with a familiar clunk. We loaded gear and pushed off into water that smelled like wet stones and algae. The cliffs rose like cathedral walls. Gulls tucked and wheeled above us in lazy formations. I remember the small sensations, the sound of paddles cutting, the way our voices bounced off stone, the taste of lake spray when the wind hit the bow. There was no immediate sign that anything was wrong, but there were small signposts of unsettlement we traded lighter for lighter. A fog bank moved in from the east like a living thing, not dense but stubborn, like breath from a sleeping giant. We thought it romantic and cursed it at once. Fog makes photos soft but also cheats you of distance. The GPS on my phone pulsed weak bars. The satellite beacon chimed its polite, untroubled chirp. Ranger Price's words about currents felt distance deep. We were young enough to feel prepared and old enough to think we knew how to behave. At the far edge of our initial plan, just after the sky thinned into the first coolness of evening, the lake began to change. That is where the main story begins, the part I have to say carefully because the details are lodged like splinters and pull at me when I press on them. We had no idea how that change would hollow out the night and leave us to measure our luck in breaths and in the weight of our choices. I will tell you what happened next. The way a storyteller leans in and lowers their voice, because what follows is the reason I say the word terrifying when I speak of Pictured Rocks now. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The fog thickened into a wall so sudden it felt like someone had dropped a stage curtain around us. One minute the cliffs were clear, bleeding color in the last gold of sunset. The next, everything was gray and flat and close. The sound changed with it. Paddles made thicker, wetter noises, and the gulls stopped calling as if a switch had been thrown. We could no longer see Miner's Castle, or even the next bend in the shoreline. Horizon and sky folded inward until the lake itself felt like a bowl around us. Ethan joked first because that was his way, a forced laugh that tried to stitch over unease. "Perfect for ghost photos," he said, tapping the side of the canoe with his paddle. Maya didn't laugh. She scanned the dim water with a headlamp, the beam stuttering like a nervous animal. The satellite beacon on my pack blinked a patient green. It felt small and ridiculous, a child waving a flashlight at the ocean. In those minutes, we didn't know whether to be impressed by the suddenness or unnerved. Either way, we kept paddling. We hugged the base of the cliff because it felt like shelter. The rocks towered over us, their rust streaks now only shades of ash. Where the shore formed tiny inlets, the water lay glass, smooth, and dark. I remember thinking, absurdly, about how safe we were. 3 people, decent gear, one of us, an environmental scientist. The mind is cowardly and inventive. It suggests comfort in the shape of logic, even as the world rearranges into something else. Then we hit a current. It wasn't the violent pull of a river, but a sudden lateral tug that kissed the canoe's keel and turned our forward push into sideways drift. My first real thought was mechanical, a hidden shallows or a submerged rock. Ethan cursed softly and dug his paddle in, but the current had other ideas. It slid us into a narrow seam where the cliff curved inward, and in seconds we were drawing toward a shadowed mouth the map didn't mark. A thin cave, half obscured and taller than it had any right to be. The fog swallowed its upper edges. Water licked the stone like a slow tongue. "That isn't on the map," Maya said. Her voice was steady because she is steady, but the edges of it trembled. "There shouldn't be a cave there. Not like that." Ethan shrugged in the way that pretends he isn't worried. "Maybe a sea cave. There are small ones along this stretch." He smiled to convince us he meant it. I didn't like that smile. The headlamp beam found the mouth of the cave and then refused to go further. There was a smell. Not quite rot, more like an old cellar left to humidity. The cliff seemed to inhale it and keep it. Against my better instincts, we were pulled in. We didn't need to be. There were safe routes back to the launch, unambiguous corridors of light on the GPS. But fear had a gravity of its own that night. Curiosity thrummed in our bones too. A human thing. When a path is forbidden by shape or sense, we lean toward it to see why. We drifted the canoe into the cave's throat. It was deeper than it looked. The paddles struck echoing stone and stopped being useful because the water calmed into a basin, so mirror smooth it reflected our faces back at us like different people. The cave widened into an inner room where the air was cold enough to taste metal. On the walls, something had been scratched. Not natural lines from sand and water, but deliberate marks. I remember the texture of the stone under my fingertips when I reached out. It was coarse and wet, and the scratches looked recent. There were symbols, long parallel lines crossed with shorter strikes, like tally marks multiplied into a pattern. I felt the foolish urge to photograph them, that small, stupid urge that has made my memories into files, and so I did. The flash from my camera ripped the darkness in half. For a moment, the cave filled with our own faces, blown up and pale, and then on the far wall, the light found something else. A smear, dark as blood in the white glare. We all fell silent. The smear had the angle and width of a hand. It was not large, but its presence made the cave suddenly intimate in a way that was wrong. A remnant, a message, or an accident, I couldn't say. But belief is a contagious thing. The 3 of us who had joked at the visitor center and argued about maps felt ourselves shrink inside that small, cold room. Ethan wanted to leave immediately. "This is stupid," he said, and pushed his paddle into the water. His breath came faster. Maya crouched and ran a tentative finger along the tally marks. Water beaded on her skin like dew. We document. We leave a note at the launch. We call Ranger Price in the morning, she said, which was her way of building scaffolding to climb from the edge of panic. I wanted to take one more photo, one frame that might map how I had felt. My camera clicked. The instant the flash died, there was a noise from deeper in the cave, a soft, patient scrape like fingernails on limestone. It could have been anything, a bird, falling pebbles, the lake changing its mood. But it was enough. Ethan stood too quickly, his paddle clattering against the gunwale. The noise repeated, not identical but intimately matched, as if in response to our movement. That response is the shard I still find myself turning over. In some stories, the escalation is external and obvious, a wolf, a villain, weather gone mad. Here, the escalation felt like a negotiation between what was human and what was not. We argued, silently and then with words, about what to do. The headlamp found the cave floor and revealed a line of footprints leading away from the water's edge and into a narrower passage. They were small, like a child's, but deep enough to displace wet sand and carry a meaning I couldn't translate. We followed them because we were foolish in curiosity, and because we were trained in a way to read tracks like sentences. The footprint trail opened into a tighter corridor where the cave sloped upward, and the air smelled older still, like a room closed for years. I felt my chest tighten and my camera grow heavy in my hands. We had to crouch, the ceiling leaned low. The tally marks had grown more frequent here, carved into the ceiling as well as the walls, and the hand smear recurred, darker in patches. The passage spit us out into a small hollow where the moonlight, thin and silvery through the fog, pooled like a shallow dish. And then Maya went quiet. Her headlamp had been swinging and then stopped. She stood frozen with one hand up, a gesture half of shame and half of warning. At first, I thought she was looking at the marks. Then I saw what she was looking at. There was a small figure sitting with its back to us on a ledge of stone. It was hunched like an animal, knees pulled up, arms wrapped around them. It might have been a child, it might not have been. The head was tilted down so the face was hidden. It made no move when we entered. Ethan made a sound that could have been either, "Hey," or an apology. I remember the silence that followed as a hard thing like the inside of a drum. The figure did not flinch. I called out, "Hello? Are you okay?" My voice felt implausible, too loud in the small space. The cave responded with the tick of a falling drop and the faint slap of lake water somewhere behind us. The figure turned its head, the smallest amount, and the hood fell back. It wasn't a child. It wasn't someone our age. The face was older than we expected, features thinned and weathered, eyes bright and wet in their sockets like stones that had been polished for a locket. They were eyes that had seen too much water. Their lips moved, but no sound came out. Before I could react, the figure, the person, stood up with an agility that contradicted the bones that showed through their clothing. They stepped forward and, without touching us, reached out and laid a single, impossibly small object on the wet stone between us. It was a key. Not ornate, not modern, just a simple brass key with an odd clip of seaweed wrapped at the handle like someone had tied a string to keep it from floating away. Maya gasped. Ethan swore. I felt the key's presence like a small verdict, an accusation that we had come where we should not have. The person said something then, a string of words in a voice like wind through hollow wood. I couldn't make out the sentence. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, they turned and walked back into shadow. The key lay between us like a question with teeth. "Take it," Ethan said too quickly, as if a choice could be made from urgency. Maya kept staring at where the figure had been, and then at the key, and the fog seemed to lean in. For one insane second, I thought of the beacon in my pack, blinking faithful and useless. We had come to this place on purpose. That is how danger sometimes works. It bides its moment, and then uses the weight of our choices to tip us over. I reached out and picked up the key. It was cold, and a thin filament of something like algae clung to it damply. When I turned it over in my hand, the cave seemed to exhale. There was a sound then, not from the person, but from the lake outside, a low, rolling boom like thunder that had nowhere to come from. The water in our canoe began to move as if fingers under the hull were flexing. The boat lurched. In those seconds, everything we had built as a narrative, our courage, our maps, our jokes, collapsed into pure reaction. We paddled for the mouth of the cave. The current, which had once pulled us in, now pushed us with a cold insistence out toward the open where the fog had thickened into a world suit of gray. We burst out of the cave into wind that bit and a lake that had lost its earlier gentleness. Behind us, the cliff's mouth drew itself closed in the fog like the door of a great house, shutting for the night. We were 3 people in a canoe with a brass key and a sense of being implicated in something we couldn't name. The whistle of the wind filled the space left by speech. The GPS showed a few blinking dots, our position, the launch far off like a promise, and then a blur where the shoreline should be. We didn't know then that the key was only the beginning. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When the canoe found the open water again, the fog seemed to close us inside a different world, one where sound had been thinned like milk and light was a rumor. We paddled in strained silence, each of us moving with a focus that felt less like bravery and more like survival. The key sat heavy in my palm. It had a chilly weight that seemed to pulse faintly, as if something tiny and secret lived inside the brass. We aimed for the launch and the thin promise of other people. The GPS swore the shore was a straight line. My eyes said otherwise. Sometimes the cliffs reappeared like phantoms in the fog, then slid away. Once we heard a bell far off, not the sharp clang of a boat, but a low, hollow sound like metal struck underwater. None of us could place it. Ethan kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see that hunched figure come tiptoeing after us. When we reached the launch, the world felt ordinary again, in a way that made my hands shake. There were footprints in the sand leading away from the water, not ours. A set that began small and widened into larger, muddied treads and then petered out toward the parking lot. We loaded the canoe in a motion that felt like a march, pale and automatic. Nobody wanted to look at the key, but we all held it in our pockets like contraband. Back in town, the diner was open and anchored to like-minded normalcy. Coffee, fluorescent lights, a television playing a fishing show. Ranger Price saw us and made a face. Not hostile, just the look of someone who recognizes the particular fatigue of being very cold and very wet. We told him what happened, leaving out the part about the figure at first because the language for that hadn't formed. He listened with the patient, careful attention Rangers have, then told us to file a report. There are storms coming in the next few days, he said. That cave, I've had campers say it looks different at night. Old stone can shift. Take the key to the station if you're worried. We promised. Then the fool thing we did was decide to go find a room and sleep it off. That night the key lay on my nightstand like a small accusation. The motel smelled of bleach and last summer. Ethan snored in thin, sharp bursts. Maya stared at the ceiling and kept rubbing the same spot on her arm as if she could erase the night by friction. I set the key on the edge of the sink and stared at the way its metal caught the cheap light. Sleep felt like a betrayal. When I finally drifted, I dreamed in fragments, the cave ceiling breathing, the tally marks peeling like wallpaper, the small figure offering the key. I woke into a half-dark that was not my room, but a memory layer where the cave still existed. My hand closed on empty air where the key had been. Panic is an efficient teacher. I scrambled out of bed, found the key where I'd left it, and felt a cold wash of gratitude that was almost shameful. I hadn't told them that in the dream I heard a voice. Not a voice in language, but a pressure against my thought, like a tide pushing against a sandbar. It asked nothing. It only remembered. The next morning, Maya vanished. I tell that sentence plainly because the plainness is what makes it sharp. We'd agreed to go back to the ranger station with the key, to hand it off and let the adults with radios make decisions. Ethan and I went down for coffee. Maya said she'd walk along the pier to collect water samples, a routine she insisted on because she could never ignore a chance to gather data. She smiled, clipped her small pack to her shoulder, and told us she'd be quick. She didn't come back. We waited. An hour bled into 2. We called her cell. It went straight to voicemail. Ranger Price sent 2 volunteers to look along the shoreline with flashlights and a thermos of bad coffee. They returned with nothing but clipped phrases and a tightness around their mouths like they'd been told to keep calm for our benefit. She might have stepped into an inlet, one of them said. Sometimes people wander. But the inlet she would have walked toward was a place we'd told her not to go near. My mind looped through the last hours and lodged on the cave, the key, the figure on the ledge. Ethan wanted to file a report. He wanted to insist on search parties. I wanted to look back at my own photos for some clue, some missed frame that might be proof against the irrational. We did both, and neither. The police asked practical questions. Did she have enemies? Any drugs? Any history of running away? The answers were flat and useless. Maya had interests and a stubborn moral clarity and a wardrobe full of field-stained shirts. She was not someone who vanished. At dusk, the fog returned as if it had been waiting. The bay filled with a hush so complete it felt like the world had been paused. I found myself at the ranger station, holding the key like a confession. Ethan and I had decided, without saying it, to go back to the cave. We would either find Maya, or we'd finally hand the key to someone who could do more than we could. Ranger Price saw the shape of our resolve and gave us one look that said both "don't" and "I won't stop you." He gave us a flare and a handheld radio. We set off in a borrowed skiff because the launch seemed too obvious for whatever logic the place followed. The skiff cut through silver water. The cliffs loomed and then vanished. The bell sound returned, this time closer, and it vibrated in my molars. Ethan kept glancing at my hand where the key was tucked away. There was something desperate in him now, a tremor I hadn't noticed until then. His jokes had dried up and his eyes had an oldness in them, as if some thread had been pulled out of his life. When we reached the mouth of the cave, the tide had changed. Water, which had guided us earlier, now held us back. We maneuvered in with a practiced breath and landed on a ledge that had been dry before. The inner room was the same. The marks, the hand smear, the smell of old wet. Only the footprints in the sand were new, and they led inward, small at first, and then larger, then suddenly stopped. We called out. Our voices returned to us small and useless. The figure did not reappear. If anything, the cave seemed to draw itself tighter, as if embarrassed at our trespass. But there was a fresh nuance. Along the far wall, someone had scrawled words in the damp stone with a finger. Not deep, but legible if you caught the right angle. I leaned close until my breath fogged it. The letters read, simply, "Leave the key." I had the key in my pocket, and my fingers went numb. Ethan swore. We did not leave. We sat in the damp and argued aloud, the way people spill their softer fears into words when silence feels like an enemy. For all our training in maps and lectures and fieldwork, neither of us could provide a plan that felt like shelter. Then, beneath the drip of the cave, we heard it, a noise like the rustle of pages. It was not wind. It wasn't coming from outside. It came from the small hollow where we'd first seen the figure. There was movement, a scraping, soft and purposeful. Something was awake in the stone itself. I thought of Maya and could not hold the idea that she would be patient in some dark place. The rational assumption that she was simply lost, hypothermic, injured, began to feel like denial. I moved toward the hollow, the flare between my teeth and the key in my hand. My steps were careful, a litany of small precautions. The hollow held only a shallow pool, and at its edge, a ring of small objects, bones, shells, a child's shoe, and a notebook like something out of a ship's locker. Pages had been wetted and warped, but someone, whoever had left them, had tucked them together with seaweed. When I picked up the book, the cover sloughed in my hand like old bark. Inside, written in a cramped, urgent hand, were notes, dates, names, and a phrase repeated over and over, as if carved into unsteady time, "Do not let it go." The page beneath had smudged lines that looked like a map, and then, in a hurried scrawl that slanted like a plea, it said, "Keeper won't sleep. He wants his key." I had the key. The cave had told me to leave it. The book told me what it feared. Above all, the part of me that had wanted to capture every image and make the night explainable wanted, fiercely and selfishly, to keep the key. Because stories need artifacts, because proof breeds confidence, because leaving it behind felt like surrendering to a story that would never end. I put the book back. I left the key in my pocket. And as we turned to go, the cave sighed and something knocked from deep within it, not against stone, but against understanding. It sounded like a child's laughter folded into the break of a wave. We paddled out under a sky that had lost its stars. Behind us, the cliff mouth, which had seemed merely dark before, took on the shape of a face when the fog shifted, an open jaw as if it were speaking. We did not speak. Ethan whispered finally, "We have to find her." We both knew the map of how to do that, and also that maps can be wrong. The key in my pocket pressed against my thigh like a heart that wouldn't let me off the hook. I couldn't tell whether keeping it meant we would find Maya, or whether it had paid us in more trouble than we could ever barter for. But some part of me, stubborn and human, wanted the key to be proof we had earned a story with an ending. We left the cave behind and carried the damp book in a plastic bag like contraband evidence. The fog swallowed the cliffs and the bell sound faded, yet the scraping in my head stayed, and the small carved phrase, "Do not let it go," repeated itself again and again, a litany that made sleep feel like another dangerous decision. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We pushed away from the cave with the book sealed in a plastic bag and the key heavy in my pocket like a second heart. The fog closed over us like a lid. For a while, paddling felt like moving through a dream you try to wake from, a resistance that answers every stroke. Ethan kept his eyes rimmed white and raw, as if sleep had fled him entirely. We both had that same thin terror. Either we would find Maya, or we would find the place that had taken her. We decided to go back one last time at low tide, because the book's hurried notes implied a rhythm to the cave and the sea, something dependent on what the lake would allow. If the keeper, whoever or whatever that word was meant, had rules, then rules could be used. That was the logic we clung to. Supernatural things, if they exist, often have methods. We were scientists and teachers and photographers, which meant we believed in the power of patterns, even when the world refused to hold one for us. By the time we reached the cliff, the fog had thinned to a soft veil. The entrance yawned like something waiting to be polite. We left the skiff and crept in with the almost habitual caution of men who'd learned to measure risk. The tally marks were everywhere now, not random, but forming bands and bands like a language. Where the small figure had sat before, the hollow felt colder, as if someone had emptied a room and left its breath behind. "Keep the flare ready," Ranger Price had told us earlier when he'd learned Maya was still missing, and our only clues were a book and a key. He had a way of saying things that sound less like order and more like absolutions. He stayed at the rim in case we needed help. He would not come in. The cave did not like witnesses who could draw it into the daylight, or maybe it honored the small theater of three. We followed the footprints again, smaller than larger, and I realized with a hard inside squeeze that the footprints sometimes appeared where sand shouldn't be, on dry ledges high above the waterline in places the tides would never have touched. That meant whatever had been moving there had its own map of the place. And then we saw fresh marks. Tiny hands pressed into softer stone, a short series of scratches like a Morse code. Maya's pack lay by the pool as if someone had set it there while they thought. The radio in it was smashed, face cracked like an egg. Ethan found the notebook we had bagged from the hollow. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped it twice before the pages opened properly. He read aloud, voice thin, "Do not let it go. Keeper won't sleep. He wants his key." Then, beneath that, in a different handwriting, a date and a single line, "He took my sister. I took the key. The sea took me." We were talking about what to do when the figure appeared again. This time we had time to watch it stand up from a ledge where it seemed folded into the stone. It came closer with a gait like a man who had been trained in patience. Up close, it was older than any person should be. Creased skin, this membrane of salt over its face, eyes like river stones. We thought it might speak, but the sound that came was not a language we could parse. It was a sound like water held in a mouth and released, a slur of vowels and wind. It did not ask for the key. It did not even look angry. It looked tired, and what tiredness can do to a thing that waits is unexpectedly cruel. It turns hunger into pleading. Ethan, brave in the wrong way, tried to edge forward with the book held like a talisman. "We can help you," he said. The figure's head tilted with the faintest tremor. The tally marks on the wall seemed to lean toward us like hearing. I had the key in my pocket, and it weighed so much that I could feel its outline through denim. For a moment, there was an old stupid ledger of things I could do. Give it back, keep it, throw it far into the lake, use it to bargain. Each option was a promise I couldn't measure the cost of. Maya's voice came then, small and raw, from the figure and not the figure at the same time. "Leave it," she said. It was her, and also not her. The syllables stretched thin like a net. We hadn't known whether she was alive or drowned or taken, but the voice was the proof like a match in the dark. "Where are you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer in the ache below my breastbone. The figure moved its hand and pointed, not to the key, but to a place deeper in the cave where the rock sloped down toward an air pocket and a darker seam. It let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a broken apology. Then it reached into the hollow it carried and brought back something small and wrapped in seaweed. A second key. It was rusted and older, teeth worn with a pattern that matched nothing I'd ever seen. When it held it out, the cave seemed to settle as if a long contested balance had tipped. The figure did not speak, it merely looked at us as if inviting a verdict. I thought of the book's warning, "Do not let it go," and of Maya's voice pleading, "Leave it." I thought of Maya's pack, the smashed radio, the tally marks, the child's shoe. There was a rhythm here. Someone had stolen a key, and someone else had kept it as a bargain. The keeper had kept vigil and now asked, with all the patience of stone, to be returned to its map. I made a choice that felt both small and huge. I took the key out of my pocket. My palm was wet with sweat, even in the cave cold. Around us, the tally marks gleamed like a story written in salt. I held the key out, and the keeper took it with hands that smelled of lake and long absence. There was a sound then, like 100 pebbles rolling down a steep shelf. The cave shifted. It was like the world tilting under a slow gear. And in an instant that seemed to stretch like a tide, Maya was there, standing up from a low seat as if she'd been waiting for the clock to strike. She looked wrong and right at once. Her hair had salt in it, and her skin had a pallor like paper left too long in a window. Her eyes were wide with a kind of knowledge that didn't belong to someone who walks the ordinary world. She stepped toward us, and the first thing she did was laugh. A thin release of air that could have been relief or sorrow. "You idiot," she said to me, as if chastising a child for touching something they'd been told not to. "You had to keep it." There was a rush of everything then, relief and anger, and the simple human rush of being together again. Ranger Price and a small volunteer team who'd followed our skiff and waited at the rim came down and took Maya in their arms. They talked in the quick, practical language of rescue, warm blankets, hot drinks, the hospital. Maya's words tumbled out in a confused knot of explanations, words about a man who mourned, a key taken from a wreck, a bargain made and remade. She wouldn't say everything. Some things she'd keep like a scar. We left the cave with the key no longer in my pocket, but still in my hand, passed to Ranger Price with a look that said the transaction was now someone else's burden. On the pier, the fog thinned to reveal a sky that was almost bright and cruel. Maya sat wrapped in a blanket, hands clasped like someone praying for small mercies. Ethan and I looked at one another, exhausted in a way that felt like being unstitched. In the days that followed, the police took reports that read like an odd fable. Maya's medical checkup found mild hypothermia and nothing stolen but time. She spoke haltingly about the figure and the book and the little key, and each time she would pause and the sentence would go somewhere private. The media wanted a simple angle: lost hiker, miraculous return. We declined interviews. Some truths are not for public consumption. The key was locked in a ranger vault with a piece of paper describing the location and a gentle warning that read like a farewell. Ranger Price would not offer more than this. Some places have histories that are older than maps. We lock things away to keep them quiet. He looked at us then, his voice a velvet caution, and said, "You did the right thing bringing it back. But the thing about the right thing is that it does not always free you of consequence." For weeks after, I had dreams of the cave breathing and of tally marks rearranging themselves like counting. Sometimes the dreams were generous, Maya laughing with the figure, the sea gentle. Sometimes they were harsher, a scoreboard of nights I couldn't pull back. Ethan stopped sleeping properly. Maya kept a notebook now, small and orderly, the opposite of the slim, water-warped thing that had bound us to that night. We never found definitive proof that what happened was anything but a strange, ungainly human drama. an old wreck, an old man who had taken a key, a person who'd been living in the cave. But the tally marks remained in my imagination like a chorus. The lake kept its ancient tides, and on some mornings, a bell sound would drift from the cliffs for no reason anyone could explain. Sometimes, when I stand at the edge of Pictured Rocks and watch the color lift off the cliffs, I think of the small figure and the keys, and the way the cave had asked for what belonged to it. If you ask whether I believe in the Keeper, I will answer honestly. I believe in what I felt. I believe in a night where stone kept secrets, and a key could weigh as much as a life. I believe that some places keep ledgers, and that sometimes human hands get folded into those lists. Months later, when the leaves turned and the tourists dwindled, I went back alone. Ranger Price met me at the trailhead with a look that asked, without words, whether I'd come for absolution or confirmation. I had no answer. We walked partway, and then I turned and left him in the parking lot. Some things are meant to close with witnesses. I needed to be alone with the memory. There is one small thing that never left me: the sound of Maya's voice that night, telling me to leave it. It has stayed with me like a compass that doesn't point north. I do not know whether keeping the key at first or handing it back later were good or bad decisions. All I have is the weight of those moments and this story. If there is a mercy in all of it, it's that we came home and that we carried the parts of each other that mattered out of the dark. If there is a warning, it's this: there are places that look like paintings until you stand before them and see the brushstrokes. Pictured Rocks will always be glorious. It will also always, for me, be terrible in the way only a beautiful, dangerous thing can be. Unignorable and holding memory like a net. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Jonathan Blake. I was 32 years old on October 13th, 2019, the night the cliffs kept their secret. People ask why I went to Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore alone. Photography and solitude were part of it, but the truth is messier. I had quit a job I didn't love and left a relationship that had become a bruise. I wanted a place older than petty grief, a shore where wind and water had shaped meaning for ages. Pictured Rocks offered painted sandstone cliffs, carved alcoves, and a shoreline that collected stories. In the weeks before I left, I studied maps and ranger notes. I learned the names: Miner's Castle, Chapel Rock, small waterfalls that sound like bells, and read warnings about slick rock and sudden storms. My sister Claire left a voicemail. "Don't do anything stupid, John," that mixed care and humor. I saved the message and packed a first aid kit anyway. The town near the park was small, its diner smelling of coffee and fried batter. The gas station attendant gave me a paper map and asked, half joking, if I believed in old tales. The ranger at the entrance advised against hiking after dark. "Cell service gets iffy," he said. I promised daylight. Promises are easy to make to people whose worry you can set aside. The path into the park begins in birch and fir and opens to ledges where the sandstone shows its layers, bands of ochre and cream, streaks of iron. The cliffs are like a slow mural. I met a few others on the trail: an elderly fisherman with a patched cap who'd been coming for decades, a young couple trading jokes, two teenagers trying to memorize a view. They made my solitude human. I set a small camp in a clearing sheltered by trees. Pitching a tent and arranging gear becomes a ritual that steadies you. It keeps the mind from spinning. By 9, the lighthouse across the lake blinked like a patient eye and the air tightened with cold. The lake breathed in long, slow sighs. Standing at the edge of the clearing, I felt both small and held, like a person tucked into the margin of an ancient book. There are practical details people often skip when telling a story. The weight of a pack, the way cold finds its way through poorly sealed cuffs, the tiny aches next morning that insist you are mortal. There are also little stories passed by locals, tales that give the land personality. The fisherman told me once, over the crackle of a camp stove, that sometimes the cliffs make knocking sounds when the ice shifts. He said it like a fact and then shrugged, the way someone accepts a landscape's oddness. I wanted to photograph the cliffs at night because I was drawn to the way moonlight pooled in crevices and made the rock look like painted skin. I packed a tripod, a headlamp, extra batteries, and a camera. I meant to stay on marked trails. I believed those preparations would protect me. Preparation, as I would learn, is not the same as immunity. I spoke little to myself that night, except to name things in the dark: path, rock, tree, like a child rehearsing a list of safe words. My heart had its own cadence, a private drum tuned by anxiety and exhaustion. The history of the place was a comfort. People had come before and left marks, not just carvings, but stories, and those stories made my own small presence seem less precarious. I told myself that walking where others had walked was an act of communion with those who had stood on the same stone an age ago. Now, for the first 700 words of this telling, I wanted to give you the who, the where, and the why. The maps, Claire's voicemail, the diner's half-joke, the ranger's caution, the fisherman's knowing. You have the town's smallness, the smell of diesel and coffee, the feel of sandstone under thumb. Those pieces are the quiet before the tide. Now the main thread begins. I walked down toward the shoreline with my headlamp and tripod to see how moonlight treated painted rock. Night redraws distance. Roots become snares, drops disappear, and the trail feels like a thin promise. Wind off Lake Superior bit my ears. At the cliff base, alcoves made small rooms, and from one came a sound not of wind or wave, a deliberate tapping, 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. "Hello?" I called, voice small against stone. The tapping stopped and resumed. Curiosity outweighed caution. My lamp found a shadowed niche. For a moment I thought a person crouched there. Then the shape moved oddly, as if loosened from surf, unfurling like wet cloth. It was not a man. The bulk read human, but its surface was silt and weed. Hair hung in mats of algae. When it turned, the light found something like an eye, glinting like a coin. Its face seemed assembled wrong, patched from driftwood and fishbone. The knocking ceased. My breath caught. My foot slipped on slick stone, and I nearly fell toward black water. Panic narrowed the world to urgent motion. I scrambled back, and the figure slid into a fissure, folding into rock as a tide folds into sand. The cliff seemed to keep its shape even after it retreated. I packed with trembling hands and climbed the trail. The tapping followed, farther now from where no cave should speak, as if the rocks had learned to tap a rhythm. Above, lighthouse blinked slow. I told myself dawn would grant sense, but that wrong face had rooted under my skin. I reached my clearing, sat on a stump, and tried to breathe. The tapping continued, deliberate, while the lake sighed and the night held breath. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The night didn't let me forget. I slept badly in fits and starts, waking every hour to the sound of tapping carried on the wind, like someone rapping on an impossible window. Dawn bled thin and gray across the lake, and the cliffs looked less like painted skin and more like strained muscle, taut with old injuries. I told myself to leave. I told myself a lot of things then. At breakfast, I made coffee over the small stove and listened to the forest waking, birds replacing the lake's long exhale with sharp notes. The fisherman from the night before ambled by with a thermos and that same patched cap. "You look like you met a ghost," he said, half laughing. I lied. "Candor's better than silence," he added. "Sometimes you need to tell someone." So I told him. I used the words I'd been rehearsing like talismans. Tapping, niche, wrong face. He chewed the rim of his cup and didn't make a joke of it. "You sure you didn't hit your head?" he asked. I glanced at my camera bag, at the tripod's collapsed legs, at the small scab on my palm from a slip on the rocks, and answered honestly, "No, I didn't hit my head." He stared at the shoreline for a long time. "There's old talk," he said finally. "Not much. Folks say the lake keeps things. It will show you what it wants you to see. Don't go poking where the cliffs had teeth." He tosses a pebble into the dirt and walked off toward a pier, shoulders bowed like a man carrying a heavy private load. The word legend is tricky. In towns where the land holds history, legend is shorthand for things people are singularly unwilling to document, but nevertheless feel. In the library in Munising, I found a woman named Marin Delroy at the archives table. Thin, hawk-nosed, hair pulled back in a knot, and she smelled of old paper and lemon oil. She pulled down maps and thick, brittle journals for me. Her voice was the kind that could make a paragraph feel like an accusation. "There are records of disappearances," she said, tapping a list where a name smudged like damp. "Mostly fishermen, once in a while a tourist who wandered off the marked path." Her finger had a faint scar. "We don't know what takes them. We have stories. The weepers, the painted ones, river brides, names change with who tells it." "How many?" I asked. Truth? Part of me hoped there was a rational count, 3, 5, a dozen, something to attach to evidence. But evidence was a tough thing around here, wet, erased, and often simply not there. Enough, she said. Enough for a town to have a cautionary tone. She leaned in, lowering her voice. There's one story about someone who lived in the cliff's shadow, an old keeper. He carved marks into the stone so the cliff would remember him. Some say the stone remembers back. That night, I wandered again despite the fisherman's cautions and Marin's vague ledger. It was like an addiction that starts small, curiosity, then a compulsive need to see the place that had shown me its stranger face. The cliffs at dusk were different, colors deepening, shadows embedding themselves in alcoves. I followed the shoreline, the way a bruised animal might follow a scent. My lamp snagged on something half buried in sand. I knelt and uncovered part of a journal, a leather flap softened by water, pages warped like ripples. Someone had stamped the cover with initials EL, and inside the handwriting slanted, neat like preserved glass. The entries were short and dated. They spoke of storms and the feel of sand in the night, of strange rhythms heard when the wind cut a certain way. One line was underlined so many times the page thinned. The cliff speaks in knocks when it needs to be heard. Do not answer. Under that, the ink smeared as if the writer had wept on the paper. A sound made me look up, clambering, small and quick, not from the rock but above it. A fisher's knot of motion, someone or something moving along the rim like a silhouette against the dying light. I turned my headlamp and aimed it upward. Where the cliff met sky, a figure balanced on a narrow ledge, outlined sharp as a nick in a coin. For a breath, I thought it was a deer. Absurd and wrong, and for a breath I thought it was my mind. The figure looked back, not with a face so much as the suggestion of one, a smear where eyes might be. It moved in a way that suggested it was adjusting to holding its weight against a surface that wanted nothing of it. I called up, voice thin. Hey, you okay? No answer. In the book of bad instincts, I pressed the wrong page and scrambled up a handline I'd fastened the night before, climbing toward that ledge because every rational bone in my body blurred into one purpose: to see, to know, to make it stop being something that only haunted me at the edge of sight. Halfway up the cliff, I realized my footing was treacherous, the sandstone slick and crumbling like cake. My breath came raw and small. My hands slipped, and in the split of a moment, I saw more of what the cliff had collected. Hair like hay tangled with seaweed, a rope looped and knotted into a fossil of a handhold, and faint markings smoothed by rain, letters half-eaten by grit. At the top, the ledge was empty. The figure was gone. But the rocks themselves were different. There were recent scratches in the sandstone, fresh as if a fingernail had been dragged along the face. The scratches formed a pattern that made my skin prickle. 3 short, a pause, 3 short. The tapping. It wasn't the cliffs merely making sound anymore. It was a language I was starting to recognize. When I climbed down, the journal was gone from where I'd left it on the sand, though my footprints still marred the beach like a thin accusation. The line of prints continued toward the water and stopped mid-slope, as if the sand itself had swallowed someone whole. I remember standing there, tripod in one hand, the wind trying to pry the camera from my grip, and thinking of all the quiet things the lake might hide just beyond the sightline. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Wind and wave kept a cruel percussion, and the tapping pattern had moved to a new cadence, nearer, as if circling my camp. I sat with the headlamp off, letting the dark be a screen for my imagination. Every sound took on intention. Every animal noise became a footfall. At 3 a.m, I heard a voice, or something that tried to make a voice, a wet creek that might have been a name. I wanted to answer and did not. There's a strange truth to the fact that fear is also a teacher. It teaches you how to listen. Morning came, and with it a neighbor I hadn't expected, Sheriff Tom Granger, a solid-featured man with a molasses patience and a look that suggested he'd been appointed by the land itself. He had my name before he said hello. He had a young deputy with him, a woman named Lena, who kept glancing at the cliff and then at the water like a person holding 2 dangerous thoughts at once. "We had a call," Tom said without preamble. "A kayaker reported seeing someone on the rocks last night. She followed, lost sight, and in the morning found this." He handed me a wet scrap of fabric with a loop of rope attached. It was the same coarse weave I'd seen entangled on the cliff. "You should leave," he said then, softer. "This place doesn't want to be hunted. It keeps what it chooses." But how do you walk away from something you are already inside? My answers are small and they never feel big enough. I packed anyway, legs numb with the aftermath of adrenaline and sleepless strain, and as I left the ranger station, a different world opened up. The town had its own rhythms of rumor. A cafe buzzed with talk of missing pets and fishermen coming back with hair and seaweed braided in their beards. A bulletin board held flyers with grainy photos, faces smiling from summer, and now asked for, "Have you seen them?" I drove back to the cliffs because leaving felt like surrendering to something that would only embolden itself by my retreat. I parked and walked faster than was wise. At the base where I had found the journal, there was now a ring of stones, not exactly natural, laid into a circle, and in the center a small pile of objects. A rusted spoon, a child's plastic truck face down in sand, a nickel, and a scrap of paper with 3 lines scratched into it. The lines matched the tapping pattern. Someone, something, had arranged them like offerings. That's where you'll have to let me pause for now. Standing over a pile of salt and rust offerings, the cliff at my back humming with a language I had just begun to learn, the sky tightening toward evening, and the tug in my chest that told me I was closer to the story than I could safely be. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The ring of offerings sat like a bruise on the shore, small things a human might leave to make sense of an impossible place. I felt foolish, an intruder with a camera and a stubborn heart. But foolishness is often a good currency in a story. It buys you the imaginings the sensible would never afford. I bent and picked up the scrap of paper with the 3 lines. The sand stuck to it like a second skin. The lines were not written but gouged, the grain pulled out in a careful, impatient hand. I had started calling the pattern the tapping because it was the easiest word to say aloud. But the scratchings, the rings of found objects, the pattern repeated like punctuation. Someone, or something, insisted on being heard. I pocketed the paper and stood. The cliffs above me darkened with the coming evening, their painted faces folding into shadow. A gull cried like a question. My feet took me toward an alcove that had, inexplicably, always tugged at my attention. It was a small concavity in the rock, sheltered from wind and shaped like a mouth. When I slid inside, I smelled peat and the wet, metallic scent of old things. The alcove held a scattering of small bones, a length of frayed rope, an old leather glove, and a cluster of sea glass, dull from storms. Someone had left a candle stub melted down to a nub, and around it, etched into the stone in a looping, uneven hand, were letters that still read, "Listen." The word looked pleading and triumphant at once, as if whoever had made it had wanted both to warn and to beg. I heard the tapping again, now beneath my feet, like a heartbeat matched to the cliff. It was closer, as if the rock itself were taking a breath and calling my name. I sat on a slab of stone and pressed my palm to it. The texture was cold and grainy, and for a terrifying second I thought the stone responded. A faint, rhythmic vibration ran under my skin, thrumming the same 3 and 3 pattern. I drew my hand back as if burned. When you sleep badly for days, reality tilts. Time stretches, moments lengthen like taffy. My belongings, my camera, my clothes, these artifacts of ordinary life felt suddenly ornamental. The journal I'd found, the scrap of paper, the glove, they were the only legitimate things in a world that had begun to fool even my senses. But objects can be lies, too. They can be planted to mislead the heart into believing it knows a story when it only knows a theater set. That afternoon, I met a woman named Eliza who ran a small boat rental out of a boathouse at the edge of town. She had a laugh that made quick corners of the world seem braver. "You're not the first to bring me a story about the rocks," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "Some people want to get close with binoculars. Others..." She looked at my camera like it was a talisman. "Want to make the cliffs sing on film." She schooled her voice down. "Be careful. The lake's a modest thing in daylight, but it keeps night for itself." I hired a kayak from her, though the outfitting felt absurdly theatrical. Paddle, life vest, a waterproof case for my camera. Eliza watched me push off. Her eyes narrowed not in suspicion, but in a way that suggested she had stood where I stood and felt the same reluctance. The water was a sheet of pewter, reflecting the cliffs like a second world. Paddling toward Miner's Castle felt like entering an illustration. The cliffs rose vertical and severe, their colors running like watercolor down the stone. The alcoves and caves were teeth waiting in the vertical mouth of the shore. Halfway along, I saw movement on a ledge. Another figure, this time clearly human, standing at a precarious point like a battering ram in silhouette. I angled the kayak closer and realized it was a woman wrapped in a heavy coat, hair braided and pinned up, face turned away. She was small against the cliff, a dark thing balanced in a frame of stone. I called, "Hey," and she turned. Her face had been sunken by grief, eyes rimmed red, cheeks washed pale. When she spoke, her voice was a paper rustle. "I heard knocking," she said. "I thought it was someone asking for help." She climbed down the path from the rim, a little injured, uncertain, and I helped her into the kayak. Her name was Mara. She'd come up from Detroit with a friend weeks earlier and never left the place that had found a way into her sleep. Her friend, she said, had gone out early one morning to look at a tide pool and hadn't returned. As we paddled toward the boathouse, I thought of how fragile stories are in the mouths of the newly bereaved. They are raw and immediate, their edges not yet dulled by rumor. Mara's grief wrapped itself around details: the color of the last sweater her friend had worn, the way she'd liked coffee with too much cream, the silly habit of tying a little ribbon in her hair. The lists grounded her memory like pegs. We told Tom, Sheriff Granger, who listened the way kind people listen, with a steady attention that does not promise miracles. A search was arranged with a pair of volunteers who combed the shoreline the following day. Sonar was called. Volunteer divers slid beneath cold sheets of water, their lamps twin needles in a void. The town hummed with that focused energy that comes when a small community turns towards something, neighbors bringing sandwiches, the library offering blankets, the diner staying open late. The divers found nothing but driftwood, a patch of old rope, and silt stirred by current. Volunteer searches uprim turned up old footprints and a cigarette pack from 10 years ago. There is an irony to search. The more people comb a place, the more artifacts of the living it reveals, but not always the thing you want most. It's as if presence begets presence, and absence perfects its camouflage. I slept poorly that night, and in the depth of a nightmare, I dreamed of stone opening like a mouth and spitting out a string of names. I woke with the sound of laughing gulls and a sliver of daylight slicing through my tent. Mara had come to my camp that morning, wrapped in her coat like a faint flag. She handed me a thin strand of seaweed braided with hair. "She used to do this," she said. The hair was dark and gritty, threaded with shell. It smelled like the lake, cold and mineral. My compulsion now had the shape of a direction: follow the pattern. The pattern pushed me back to the alcoves where the scratching had been fresh. That day, the cliff presented something new. Initials, EL, carved deep and deliberate, the same as on the journal I'd found. Underneath, someone had carved another set of letters, less sure, nearly eroded, MA. The two sets of initials sat under one another like a ledger of people who had tried to mark themselves against the rocking forgetfulness of the shore. I remembered the fisherman's shrugged caution. Don't go poking where the cliffs had teeth. But I had already poked. Poking did not feel like a choice so much as the form love takes when it wants to claw a presence into being. The lake had become for me an argument I could not stop making. That evening, Sheriff Granger came by the boathouse after a long day. He looked more worn than before, like someone whose worry had been turned small and compact by repetition. Repetition. He told me quietly, "We've had 6 disappearances in 30 years. Sometimes the lake returns pieces, sometimes it keeps entire people." He did not speculate about why. He didn't need to. The town's silence between the words carried its own verdict. "If you go back out," he said, "go with someone. Don't go alone." I wanted to promise, but my feet already ached for the shoreline. The cliff's language had become my obsession, and the lines carved into stone were a map that refused to be tidy. There's a peculiar loneliness in being the person who sees patterns others reduce to wind. It makes you both an oracle and a pariah. The tide that night was wrong for kayaking. The waters pushed higher and closer, but I could not stay away. I parked at the edge of the lot and walked the old logging trail, headlamp off. The cliffs loomed like sleeping beasts above me. The air was full of the lake's breathing and the wet, sharp smell of kelp. The tapping began again, softer now, almost conversational, as if the cliff had lowered its voice to tell a secret. I approached the alcove where Listen had been carved. The candle stub was gone, replaced by a small shell scored with 3 kinds of scratches. I understood then with a clarity that felt like drowning. The cliff wanted something in return for what it gave. It wanted attention. It wanted to be remembered. The bargains the landscape makes are ancient and not always human-friendly. I knelt and placed my palm over the shell, feeling its ridges. The tapping moved underfoot, and then impossible animal sound, something touched the back of my neck. It was not a hand, but the sensation of being marked, a cool, wet brush like a fish's scale. I froze. The sound near my ear was not knocking now, but a whisper, a voice made of tide and rock, nothing like human speech, and yet suggesting the cadence of names. I could either walk away or listen. I stayed. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The cliff's voice was not a thing you could translate easily. It began as pressure in my teeth, then as a pattern of knocks that was suddenly grammar. 3 short, pause, 3 short, the rhythm that had threaded the shore since I arrived. When I chose to listen, the sound rearranged itself into something like speech. Not words, but names and half notes that felt like names. They came as images too, hands, braids of hair, a spoon, a child's truck. And the more I let them in, the clearer they became. I remembered the initials in the journal, EL, and the fresh scrawl beneath it, MA. Those letters were not just names, they were anchors. They told me how the cliff remembered people, by what they left and how the living remembered them. The offerings, the carved letters, the repeated tapping, these were ways of asking the lake to hold someone. Sometimes holding meant safety. Often it meant something else. I thought then of bargains. The town had its bargains, the sheriff's quiet warnings, the fishermen's shrugged myths. The cliffs had their own. In the alcove where Listen was carved, the rock seemed to lean inward, like a person telling a secret. I sat on the stone and let the cadence wash over me. Nothing in me wanted to go on being the kind of person who could walk away. Something else had already taken the shape of the shore in me. I took the scrap of paper with the 3 gouged lines and set it beside the candle stub's melted wick. I found the journal and opened the page where EL had written, trembling and watermarked, "When the lake asks, answer with your name and the memory. It likes to be sung to." The sentence had a kind of coherent madness to it, but it was clearer than any map I'd had. That night, around the ring of offerings on the sand, I began to speak the names I had learned. Mara's friend, Anna Lee, M.A. I said her name like a prayer, like a plea. I spoke the initials that had been carved, the list of small things they'd left, a ribbon, a spoon, a truck. My voice trembled in the cold air. The tapping responded, not with anger, but with an urgency, as if the cliff wanted the names uttered in a certain order. "You want me to do this?" I asked out loud, ridiculous to think a land could hear me. The cliff answered by hushing the gulls, a silence like the held breath before a descent. Something moved in the sand near my boot, soft and quick. I dug with my hands and found the corner of a ribbon, mud stiff. It was the ribbon Mara had described. My heart did something I could not name. Relief, terror, a giddy belief that I had pulled something back from the dark. I lifted the ribbon and ran my fingers along the frayed edge until it loosened. The lake smelled close and personal, like breath. I took the ribbon to Mara and watched her press it to her face as if it belonged to her like bone. She wept, yes, but not only in grief, also in recognition that something returned. Word spread through town. A small thing came back from the rocks. Hope, for a night, warmed even the sheriff's shoulders. That relief was the cliff's gift, and like any gift, it had strings. After the ribbon came more. A spoon discovered in a crevice. A child's toy lodged where tide met rock. Each item that returned left the finder less whole in a way that wasn't visible at first. I kept dreaming of the names the cliff hummed now, and each dream pulled me closer to the alcove where Listen sat, like a warning. There are old men who will tell you the land chooses its keepers. I laughed at it at first, because the idea of geology forming a priesthood feels fanciful, but then I found myself sleeping less and hearing more. My hearing turned predatory, cataloging the small noises the lake made, the way small rocks settled in a pocket, the particular whisper of shell against bone. I started to notice patterns, how those who returned items were different afterward, quieter, as if part of their voice had been left in a crevice. I started to feel the same absence. My reflection in the diner window looked tarnished, like an old coin. Claire's voicemail that had once chastised me for being reckless played in my head, muttering like a second tide. I had come to Pictured Rocks to find myself and to take photographs that made sense of a life. Instead, I had become a medium through which a place sorted its losses. The night the cliff demanded more, I realized it wasn't only asking for memory. It wanted someone to listen in a sustained, deliberate way. The journal hinted at rituals, not talismans so much as attention, the slow naming of persons and things in a sequence that the stone could keep. The more names you read in the correct cadence, the clearer the cliff became, until it felt less like land and more like a being. I thought of making a bargain for Mara's friend and the others, my words for their return. I thought of bargains as equal exchanges, but the cliff's math was older. It took and reshaped. I felt my hand go cold and the hair along my arms stand. The banging rhythm thrummed underfoot, and then, soft, like someone speaking right behind my shoulder, I heard my sister Claire's voice, but not as memory. It called my name as if from far away, coaxing me. I had not told anyone that my sister's voice haunted me still. Only I knew that her voicemail had become a comfort and an admonition. When the cliff made that sound, Claire's name spoken in a wind I could not explain, I felt something inside me untie. Logic said run. Loyalty said stay. Curiosity said stay longer and see. I carved my initials into a flake of sandstone that matched the journal, JB, and placed it in the alcove beside the candle nub. My fingers trembled so badly the letters were messy. Then I read aloud the names I had found in the journal and the things that had been left with them. Elias Larkin, made marks to stay. Anna Lee, ribbon. Mara, braid. Eliza, boat. I spoke until my throat was raw, and the strip of stone under my palm felt warm with the echo of my voice. When I finished, the tapping stopped. For a moment, there was a silence so complete it felt dangerous. Then the cliff exhaled, and a small shape washed up near the ring of offerings. A knitted cap, damp and folded, with the initials AL sewn in the brim. Mara cried, and for a dizzy second, the town rose with her as if the land had answered its long-held question. We found other things in the weeks after, a letter, pages of a diary wrapped in oilcloth, a fisher's knife tied in kelp. Each return was a relief that all too quickly curdled into the knowledge that taking had been required. Sheriff Granger looked at me once with tired eyes and said, "You did good. You did dangerous work." He didn't say what I would eventually understand. That work changes the worker. Months later, the changes in me were clear to those who knew me best. My hands were always damp around the nails, as if I'd been digging under tide forever. People gave me space at the diner. Mara left town eventually with what remained of her friend's things. She hugged me once in the parking lot and said, "You were brave." She did not ask how much I had given. What had I given? In the end, I left more than my initials in a flaking slab of stone. When you read names to a thing that collects them, you become a ledger yourself. Memory is a mutual claim. The cliff took an ease from me. I no longer slept without walking the shoreline in the early dawn. My hometown voice that used to joke at margins had thinned into a person who listened for rhythms. One evening I returned to the alcove where listen had been carved. The letters had been smoothed by weather, but still legible like an old speaking tooth. I pressed my hand against the stone and felt a faint vibration, like a pulse. It answered me now with a gentleness that felt like gratitude and a warning. The lake will return what it wishes to those who call to it, but always with a fingerprint left on the caller. If this is a confessional, then let me be plain. I did not die on those cliffs. But I am not the same Jonathan Blake who arrived on October 13th, 2019. I carry salt in my pockets now and a hunger for names. Sometimes I hear tapping in unlikely places, the rim of a coffee cup hop, the dented metal of a mailbox, and I know some part of the shore is speaking along the world's seam. People ask me if the cliffs are evil. I tell them no, not evil, just a place with its own desires, older than us and not much interested in our definitions. It keeps what it chooses because it has always kept things. It gives back sometimes. It bargains. It remembers in ways that feel like tenderness until you realize tenderness requires a price. If you ever go to Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, respect the ranger's warnings. Don't stray after dark. Bring someone. If you hear tapping where rocks should be silent, don't answer as I did without thinking of what you might owe in return. This is the end of what I will tell you. The cliffs keep their secrets, but they sometimes let you hold a small, shining thing that belonged to someone else. They will change you if you let them. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.